Hi guys. Tonight we're going to take a slow, meandering journey through the long and dazzling history of the Spanish monarchy. A tale of golden empires, vast oceans, powerful rulers, devastating wars, and the echoes of faded glory. Over the next 24 parts, we'll unravel a story that begins in ancient Iberia and stretches through conquests, crusades, dynasties, and revolutions. The Spanish monarchy has seen moments of unmatched splendor and brutal collapse, stories whispered in candlelit corridors and roared across Atlantic winds. Let's dim the lights in our minds, slow our breathing, and begin ever so gently at the beginning. It was long before Spain even existed as a nation. In the western reaches of Europe, on the Iberian Peninsula, a jagged land of sun-baked plateaus, rugged mountains, and wild, endless coasts, a mosaic of tribes thrived. There were the Iberians and the Celts, and in the melting pot of their cultures, others joined. Phoenicians from the east, carving harbours along the coast, Greeks bringing myths and olives, and Carthaginians, strong and ambitious, who saw Iberia as a new frontier. They brought trade, religion, and the earliest shadows of empire. But as night falls gently across the ancient world, we hear the footsteps of legions, Roman legions, as they march from the east with their precise formations and imperial dreams. They came not only for land, but for glory and gold. The conquest of Iberia would take over 2 centuries, a long, grinding war that brought Roman law, roads, aqueducts, and cities, but also rebellion, destruction, and assimilation. The Iberian Peninsula, now a Roman province, became Hispania. The name would echo into the future, woven into kings' titles and imperial declarations. Romanization was thorough. Latin became the language of the land. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, spread in whispers at first, then openly as emperors converted and temples were transformed into churches. But as the Roman Empire aged and cracked, shadows returned to Iberia. Germanic tribes moved in, the Suebi, the Vandals, and most powerfully, the Visigoths. They came not as destroyers but as settlers, founding kingdoms of their own atop Roman ruins. By the 6th century, the Visigoths had established a kingdom centered in Toledo, ruling much of the Iberian Peninsula. This kingdom would become the crucible for what would, many centuries later, be called Spain. The Visigoths maintained Roman traditions, law, and Christian religion, though now under the banner of Arianism, later aligning with Catholicism. Their kings ruled through shifting alliances, betrayals, and a noble class often more powerful than the crown. But here, dear listener, a whisper begins. A whisper from the desert winds of Arabia, crossing North Africa with fire and faith. In 711, it came with a roar. Tariq ibn Ziyad landed at Gibraltar, and within a few years, most of Iberia fell to the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate. The Visigothic kingdom, brittle and divided, crumbled like sand beneath a rising tide. Yet not all was lost. In the damp, forested mountains of the north, remnants of resistance kindled. In a small, rugged valley of Asturias, a chieftain named Pelayo refused to surrender. At Covadonga, his warriors held fast, and the Reconquista, the long, slow push to reclaim Iberia for Christianity, was born. Now the land was divided. Al-Andalus to the south, cultured, rich, Islamic. Christian kingdoms, small, poor, defiant, to the north. For centuries, these parallel worlds flourished and fought. Al-Andalus birthed scholars, poets, and architecture that still stuns. The Christians carved kingdoms from rocky soil, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and Castile. Each Christian kingdom had its own monarchs, ambitions, and dynasties. But amid the quarrels, battles, and intermarriages, a vision emerged, the idea that perhaps these scattered realms might one day unite, not by war, but by blood. In 1469, it happened. A wedding, quiet on the surface, but shaking the future. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs. 2 crowns joined not into one, but into a tandem of power that would forge the shape of Spain. Their marriage laid the cornerstone of the modern Spanish monarchy. Isabella was resolute, intelligent, and devout. Ferdinand, cunning and bold. Together they reconquered Granada in 1492, ending Muslim rule in Iberia after nearly 800 years. That same year they sponsored an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus. The world would change forever. From humble mountain kingdoms and imperial ashes, the Spanish monarchy was rising, no longer just a European power, but a global one. The empires of gold and glory were still ahead. Let your thoughts settle on that. The marriage that united Spain, the fall of Granada, the sails of Columbus on the Atlantic horizon, and we'll return next time to follow those sails into the unknown. Good night for now. The sea was wide and endless, darker than ink, stretching into a mysterious and nameless world. As 1492 waned and the wind filled the sails of three fragile ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, a strange anticipation crept over Spain. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, had placed a bold wager on a man few trusted and even fewer understood, Cristobal Colon, or as history would remember him, Christopher Columbus. He was not Spanish, but Janus by birth, a sailor, a dreamer, with a voice both calm and fevered when he spoke of lands beyond the Western Ocean. For years he had knocked on royal doors, drawing maps of worlds uncharted and promising riches that glittered only in imagination. Most laughed him off, but Isabella, pragmatic, deeply Catholic and yet not without vision, finally listened. When Columbus made landfall in what he believed to be the Indies, he unknowingly opened a new chapter, not just for Spain, but for the world. Gold, spices, slaves, the riches of the New World shimmered in reports that trickled back across the ocean. But beyond material wealth, there was something else, the lure of empire. The Spanish crown, now anchored in both Castile and Aragon, saw a chance not only to rule, but to shape the globe. The Spanish monarchy transformed in spirit after that voyage. A kingdom of farmers, knights, and friars was evolving into the nucleus of a global force. Every galleon that returned from the Americas carried not just treasure, but confirmation that Spain's destiny was imperial. Columbus would voyage again and again, but he would not find China. He would find chaos, rebellion, failure. And yet Spain claimed the Americas as its own. But empires are not built on dreams alone. Back in Iberia, the Catholic monarchs were reshaping society. In 1492, as the armies marched into Granada, a decree was signed. The Jews of Spain, unless they converted to Christianity, were to leave the kingdom. This was followed in time by similar pressures on Muslims. Spain was becoming united not just politically, but religiously, brutally, inflexibly. The Inquisition, already established in 1478, now sharpened its tools. It was not a uniquely Spanish invention, but under Isabella and Ferdinand, it found a cruel zeal. Converts from Judaism and Islam, the conversos and moriscos, were suspected of secret heresy. Trials, torture and fear bled through the streets. This was the dark cost of unity, a kingdom purified by fire. Still, the monarchy was strong. Their children were betrothed across Europe. Catherine of Aragon would marry into England's Tudor dynasty, eventually becoming the ill-fated wife of Henry VIII. Joanna, another daughter, would wed Philip the Handsome of the Habsburgs, a name that would soon dominate the throne of Spain. Through calculated marriages, Isabella and Ferdinand planted seeds in the soil of Europe's most powerful houses. Then, in 1504, Isabella died. The Castilian queen, stern, shrewd, and adored by many, left behind not only a crown, but a fragile arrangement. Ferdinand retained rule over Aragon, but Castile would now fall to their daughter, Joanna. Yet Joanna's mind had long been under suspicion. Her grief, her behaviour, her outbursts, many whispered she was mad. Her husband, Philip, tried to take control. Ferdinand resisted. The Spanish monarchy, at the moment of its greatest promise, wavered under internal struggle. Philip died suddenly in 1506. Joanna descended into deep mourning, refusing to part with his body. She would be locked away in Tordesillas for much of her life, known to history as Joanna the Mad. Though whether she was truly insane or merely inconvenient remains a question of cold politics. From this tangled grief emerged a new figure, Charles. Born in Ghent in 1500, Charles was the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand and of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Through these ties, he inherited not just Spain, but the sprawling dominions of the Habsburgs, Austria, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, and eventually the title of Holy Roman Emperor. When Charles I of Spain ascended to the throne in 1516, he became the most powerful monarch in Europe. In 1519, he would also become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. His rule would stretch across continents, a man at the centre of the first true world empire. But the empire brought challenges as vast as its territories. The Reformation swept through Germany and the Low Countries, threatening Catholic dominance. Wars raged in Italy. In the Americas, conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, flooding Spain with unimaginable wealth and violence. Charles, heavy with responsibility, moved between courts and war councils. His rule was one of tension, between old and new, Catholic and Protestant, Spanish and German, reform and reaction. He saw himself as a defender of Christendom, a Caesar for the modern age. But even emperors grow weary. In 1556, Charles abdicated. He divided his empire, giving the Spanish throne to his son Philip and the imperial title to his brother Ferdinand. Charles retreated to a monastery in Yuste, surrounded by clocks, weary of time. Philip II, his son, would become the architect of Spain's golden age, and its slow unravelling. But for now, let the night settle with the image of Charles, a monarch born of ambition, raised among empires and laid to rest beneath quiet cloisters. A man who tried to hold the world in his hands. We will return in time to his son Philip, and to the zenith of the Spanish monarchy's splendour and the gathering storms. The world Charles had tried to hold in his hands now passed to Philip, Philip II of Spain. A solemn figure, thin and serious, with a beard that framed his stern, introspective face. Born in Valladolid in 1527, he had been raised not in the rolling hills of Castile, but in the dim palaces of the Habsburg court. Fluent in Latin, cautious in speech, devout in practice, Philip was a ruler moulded by discipline, not charisma. He was not his father's son in temperament, but he was his heir in duty. When he ascended the Spanish throne in 1556, Philip inherited a realm like no other. It stretched from the silver-laced Andes of Peru to the steppes of Hungary, from the sun-drenched ports of Naples to the spice-laden archipelagos of the Philippines, named, in fact, after him. Spain was now more than a kingdom. It was an empire whose veins pulsed with bullion, conquest, and faith. Philip did not rule as a wanderer, as his father had. He ruled from the heart, from Spain itself, and more specifically, from a stark and imposing palace monastery nestled among the Guadarrama Mountains, El Escorial. Cold, austere, geometric, it was a reflection of Philip's mind and vision. A place of prayer, a seat of power, and the architectural embodiment of Catholic resolve. Philip believed it was Spain's divine mission to defend and expand Catholicism. He was not merely a king, he saw himself as God's instrument on earth. The world, to him, was a spiritual battleground. Heresy in all forms, Protestant, Muslim, or even mystically deviant, was a disease that had to be cleansed. Under his watch, the Inquisition burned hotter, and censorship darkened the pages of thought. And yet, even as he fortified the soul of the nation, the empire grew. In the New World, conquistadors continued to carve kingdoms. Silver poured into Spanish coffers from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, coins stamped with the royal seal, sailing across oceans in galleons that glittered like floating vaults. With it came trade, slaves, and power. But with it, too, came corruption, inflation, and dependence. Spain, drunk on silver, was losing sight of its roots. Back in Europe, Philip's ambitions stirred conflict. He married Mary Tudor of England, seeking to bring that island back into the Catholic fold. But Mary died childless in 1558, and Elizabeth I took the throne, Protestant, proud and defiant. Philip proposed marriage to her as well. She declined. Thus began a long and bitter dance between Spain and England, one that would end in sails and cannon fire. But before that crescendo, there was another crisis, one closer to home. In the Low Countries, the Dutch had grown wealthy, independent, and increasingly Protestant. Philip's harsh measures to suppress their faith and autonomy sparked a revolt, the 80 Years' War. It was a slow-burning rebellion, marked by brutal reprisals and religious fury. The Duke of Alba, Philip's general, earned the name the Iron Duke for his pitiless executions. Towns were razed, innocents slaughtered. The revolt hardened. Spain, though powerful, found itself mired in a swamp of resistance. In 1580, a twist of fate brought Philip yet another crown, that of Portugal. Its king had died without an heir, and Philip, through dynastic claims, seized the opportunity. With it came the vast Portuguese empire, Brazil, African ports, the spice routes of Asia. Spain now presided over the greatest territorial empire the world had ever known. And yet, Philip felt no peace. In 1588, he launched the most ambitious military campaign of his reign, the Spanish Armada. A massive fleet, carrying soldiers, priests and cannon, set sail to invade England and dethrone Elizabeth. The plan was bold, calculated and full of faith. It ended in disaster. Storms scattered the ships, English fire ships struck at night, and the once mighty armada limped home in tatters. It was a psychological blow more than a strategic one. Spain was still rich, still powerful, but the myth of invincibility had cracked. Meanwhile, back in Castile, the burdens of empire were showing. Peasants toiled while nobles avoided taxes. Bureaucracy ballooned. The silver that had once flowed like wine now vanished into foreign debts and endless wars. Famine struck. Plague returned. And through it all, Philip sat at El Escorial, surrounded by papers, maps, and prayers. A king cloistered not in luxury, but in the weight of his mission. He grew old. His health faded. His son, Don Carlos, troubled and violent, had died in mysterious circumstances years earlier, perhaps by royal command. His last years were haunted by fever, gout, and solitude. In 1598, Philip died, alone, his body so ravaged that his attendants had to peel his skin from the sheets. He left behind a legacy both awe-inspiring and tragic. Spain had reached the peak of its global might under his rule, but at what cost? Its treasury was empty, its people weary, its enemies emboldened. But his vision endured, a Spain that stood for Catholic truth, royal absolutism, and imperial ambition. Now the crown passed to his son, Philip III, a quieter, less imposing figure. And with him began a new era, one of shadows and silken decay. Let us pause here with the scent of incense still hanging in El Escorial's chapels and the last light of Spain's golden age flickering gently. We'll return soon to follow that flicker into twilight. The corridors of El Escorial were quieter now. The echo of firm footsteps was gone, replaced by the whisper of courtiers and the soft sighs of silk. Philip II, the austere warrior of the faith, had passed, and in his place rose a king cut from a different cloth. Philip III, born in 1578, ascended the throne in 1598, just 20 years old, pale, polished, and pious, yet lacking the iron will of his father. Spain, mighty on paper but hollowed within, was entering an age not of thunder but of quiet erosion. Philip III was not a king who ruled, he was a king who delegated. Into the vacuum stepped the Duke of Lerma, Francisco Gómez de Sandoval. Ambitious, calculating, and ravenous for wealth, Lerma became the true master of Spain. He was the first of many validos, royal favourites who would govern in the name of weak monarchs, wielding real power while the king receded into ritual, prayer, and private diversions. Under Lerma, the court moved from Madrid to Valladolid, a shift that cost a fortune and brought only confusion. Corruption flourished. Offices were sold, favours traded like currency, and nobles enriched themselves while commoners bore the weight. Gold still came from the Americas, but it vanished into wars, loans, and decadence. Inflation ballooned. The economy, once buzzing with craft and trade, sagged under the burden of imperial ambition and domestic neglect. Meanwhile, the Habsburg court sank into ceremony. Every movement became ritual. The king dined behind curtains unseen. Nobles fought for proximity, not purpose. The machinery of empire, so fearsome under Charles and Philip II, now groaned with inertia. And yet Spain still held the illusion of greatness. In foreign affairs, the kingdom tried to maintain the posture of a lion. The long Dutch revolt dragged on, draining blood and treasure. In 1609, Spain signed a truce, a temporary pause, not a resolution, with the rebellious United Provinces. It was, in effect, an admission of exhaustion. That same year, a tragic event unfolded within Spain itself, the expulsion of the Moriscos. These were the descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity, sometimes sincerely, often under duress. For decades, they had lived in a strange limbo, tolerated but mistrusted. They spoke Arabic, maintained traditions, and were suspected, without evidence, of disloyalty. Philip III, pressured by zealots and courtiers hungry for confiscated land, ordered their removal. From 1609 to 1614, hundreds of thousands of Moriscos, men, women, children, were expelled. Whole villages emptied. Fields lay fallow. A class of skilled farmers and artisans vanished. It was a cultural amputation. Spain, in its quest for religious purity, bled itself. And still the court danced. Lerma, bloated with power, grew complacent. He built palaces, funded religious art, and acquired vast estates. But enemies gathered. In 1618, his own son, ambitious and envious, engineered his downfall. Lerma was dismissed, exiled to a monastery, and replaced by the Duke of Uceda, who continued the same patterns of graft and flattery. Philip III, detached as ever, aged quietly. He loved hunting, music, and religious devotion, but he never truly ruled. His reign was a dream in velvet, beautiful but fading at the edges. When he died in 1621, at the age of 42, the crown passed to his son, Philip IV. And with that transfer came the last flare of brilliance before the long descent. But before we move forward, let us rest a moment in the soft candlelight of Philip III's Spain. It was a time of quiet collapse, masked by ceremony, sweetened by wealth, dulled by indifference. The embers of empire still glowed, but the fire was not being stoked. A nation that had once sailed to the edge of the world now drifted in its own illusion. We'll return to witness the final shimmer. The court of Philip IV, the golden painters, the silver-tongued favourites, and the slow unravelling of an empire grown too vast, too proud, and too tired. When Philip IV took the throne in 1621, Spain was still a vast empire in name, but the cracks had begun to show. He was just 16, tall, elegant, and regal, with the pale skin and prominent jaw of the Habsburg line. The world that awaited him was not one of conquest, but of crisis. And yet, for a time, his reign would shimmer with the illusion of grandeur, a twilight masquerading as noon. Like his father before him, Philip IV did not rule alone. Into his confidence stepped a new favourite, Gaspar de Guzman, better known as the Count Duke of Olivares. Intelligent, forceful, and ambitious, Olivares believed Spain could be saved from decline, not by retreat, but by renewal and sacrifice. He envisioned a centralized monarchy, united in purpose, efficient in administration, and reinvigorated for the global struggle. But visions, as always, would collide with reality. Olivares sought to reform the system, to redistribute the burdens of empire beyond Castile, to involve Aragon, Catalonia, and Portugal more equally. He tried to enforce tax reform, military conscription, and bureaucratic standardization. But Spain was not a monolith. It was a fragile mosaic of kingdoms, each fiercely protective of its privileges. The deeper Olivares pushed, the louder the resistance grew. Meanwhile, abroad, the fires of the 30 Years' War burned through Europe. It began as a religious conflict in the Holy Roman Empire, but quickly drew in every major power. Spain, tied by blood and duty to the Austrian Habsburgs, plunged into the chaos. Olivares believed that Spanish arms could still command fear, and at first they did. Spanish troops, the famed tercios, marched across battlefields in Germany, Flanders, and Italy. Victories came, but so did exhaustion. The treasury drained, the people bled. The silver fleets from the Americas still arrived, but more sporadically, and often intercepted by Dutch or English ships. Inflation surged, grain failed. The empire staggered under the weight of its own ambition. In the midst of this storm, something beautiful happened. Philip IV, though inattentive to governance, was a passionate patron of the arts. His court became the beating heart of Spain's golden age. Poets, playwrights, painters, all found favour in Madrid. The king himself loved theatre and commissioned lavish spectacles. He surrounded himself with genius. None shone brighter than Diego Velázquez. Velázquez, a Seville-born painter of uncanny skill and restraint, became court painter and chronicler of a world in decline. His brush captured not just appearances but truths, the weariness behind royal eyes, the stillness in silence. In Las Meninas, perhaps his most famous work, Velázquez painted not just a portrait, but a meditation on power, perception, and presence. In its dim hues and soft glances, we see a court still rich but haunted. And so it was across the realm. In 1640, the pressures Olivares had applied cracked the empire. Catalonia rose in revolt, joined by Portuguese rebels who declared independence under the House of Braganza. The rebellion in Portugal was swift and decisive. Spain would spend 28 years trying, and failing, to retake it. The twin crowns that had been joined since Philip II were now broken. In Catalonia, a bitter war raged. At times the region even placed itself under the protection of France. Spanish troops poured in, and the fighting dragged on, costly and demoralizing. The unity Olivares dreamed of dissolved into civil strife. By 1643, the king dismissed Olivares, his once trusted valido, now a scapegoat for disaster. The Count Duke retreated into disgrace, his reforms abandoned, his legacy smeared. Philip IV continued to rule, but without the fire of purpose. He aged into sorrow, his court turned inward. His reign, once promising, dissolved into a blur of military losses and financial collapse. Even the tercio, the pride of Spanish arms, suffered humiliation. In 1643, at the Battle of Rocroi, they were decisively defeated by French forces. It was more than a loss. It was the end of an era. The invincible Spanish infantry, the steel wall of Habsburg power, had been broken. At home, the people suffered. Plague returned. Famine lingered. Castile, long the empire's backbone, was brittle and hollow. The economy spiraled, the countryside emptied. The silver from the New World no longer dazzled. It vanished into debts before it reached Madrid. Yet Philip clung to power. In 1661 he had a son, the future Charles VI, frail from birth, with the features of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. His very existence became a metaphor for the monarchy, noble but broken. Philip died in 1665, a king who had once ruled the known world, now leaving behind a fragmented realm, a disfigured heir, and the fading echo of greatness. But even in decline there remained a kind of dignity, a haunting beauty. The Spain of Philip IV was a court of mirrors and masks, of poetry whispered as cities burned, of paintings hung on crumbling walls, a world of art and illusion. Let that image settle, the gentle brush of Velázquez painting a weary king as distant thunder rumbles from Catalonia and Portugal. We will return to the fragile reign of Charles II, the last Habsburg of Spain, and the ghost that would haunt a continent. The child was delicate, his body trembling like parchment in a breeze. Born in 1661 to Philip IV and his second wife, Mariana of Austria, Charles II was the last breath of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty worn thin by centuries of intermarriage, exhausted by war and hollowed by ritual. From the moment of his first breath, whispers followed him. He was not just weak, he was malformed, intellectually stunted, and plagued by illnesses that no physician could fully name or cure. The people of Spain called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. It was a nickname born from fear, from superstition, from the deep and growing suspicion that something unnatural had taken hold of their king. And in a way they were not wrong. Charles was the final heir of a dynasty that had folded in on itself. His blood carried too many repetitions. His jaw jutted, his tongue was too large, and his body refused to grow into the robe of kingship, yet he was crowned. In 1665, at just 4 years old, Charles II became King of Spain. The crown weighed heavier than his small head could bear. Until he came of age, his mother, Queen Mariana, ruled as regent. Fiercely protective, but indecisive and surrounded by rivals. Factions bloomed like mould in the court, each vying for influence over the boy king and the vast, crumbling empire he had inherited. Spain, once the mightiest power in the world, now resembled a grand palace whose foundations were rotting beneath gold-leafed walls. The treasury was empty. Inflation ravaged the countryside. Trade had faltered. Pirates preyed upon the treasure fleets. In the Americas, colonial governors acted with increasing independence, far from the paper-thin commands of Madrid. The once mighty army was reduced to scattered garrisons, and Spain's allies eyed it with pity rather than respect. Charles, meanwhile, stumbled through childhood. He learned to speak late, to walk later still. He was surrounded by priests, physicians, and astrologers. Some blamed witches. Others blamed his mother. Few dared say aloud what was visible to all, that the Habsburg line had collapsed into itself, and Spain now drifted under the rule of a shadow. But amid this slow decay, court life continued. Masks, ceremonies, and processions filled the days. Even the rituals of monarchy persisted with stubborn pride. Charles was dressed in royal splendor, paraded through cities, offered as a symbol of continuity. His body may have faltered, but his title endured. Rey de las Españas, King of the Spains, of Castile, of Aragon, of Naples, of the Indies. As he reached adolescence, it became clear that Charles would never produce an heir. He suffered from infertility, possibly the result of genetic disorders. His advisors, desperate to preserve the dynasty, arranged a marriage with a French princess, Marie-Louise of Orléans. She was young, bright, and full of hope. But life at the Spanish court, cold, severe, and suffocating, broke her spirit. She bore no children and died young, leaving behind grief and more questions. A second marriage followed to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. She too brought no heir. Now the question that loomed over all others was succession. Who would inherit this empire of shadows? Two great houses stood poised, the Bourbon dynasty of France and the Austrian Habsburgs. Each had ties to the Spanish crown through Charles's sisters and nieces. Each watched Madrid like a dying star, hoping to be named in the will. Europe grew anxious. Diplomats schemed. Armies shifted restlessly. Spain's fate, once the concern of kings and conquerors, had become a matter for lawyers, priests, and spies. Inside the palace, Charles aged without truly aging. His face sagged prematurely, his mind faltered, and his body grew frailer each year. He suffered seizures, hallucinations, and long periods of melancholia. Yet he clung to the throne. He saw himself as chosen by God, even as nature and fate conspired against him. In his final years, Charles became obsessed with the supernatural. He ordered exorcisms. He demanded investigations into whether he had been cursed. He sought answers not from ministers, but from mystics and monks. The court held its breath, waiting for a decision, for the name he would write into history as his successor. In 1700, at last, the decision came. Charles, broken, ill and childless, named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. It was a choice that would plunge Europe into war. That same year, Charles II died. He was 38 years old but looked twice that. His death was not mourned as the end of a reign, it was mourned as the end of a world. The Spanish Habsburgs, the dynasty that had ruled for nearly 2 centuries, had come to an end. The throne of Spain now lay open, and Europe would not accept the decision without blood. Let us rest for a moment with Charles, a monarch made not by will or strength but by lineage and inevitability, a symbol of how power, once unassailable, can fade into frailty, a king more mourned for his fate than remembered for his rule. The War of the Spanish Succession was about to begin, and with it, the map of Europe would shift once more. The ink on Charles II's will had barely dried when the quiet halls of the Escorial gave way to the clatter of arms. His chosen successor, Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince, grandson of the Sun King Louis XIV of France, had been named King of Spain. But where Charles had whispered, Europe now shouted. The question of succession, long simmering beneath the surface of diplomacy, erupted into open conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession had begun. It was not merely a dispute over inheritance. It was a war about balance, of power, of legacy, of fear. For if Philip, a French Bourbon, now wore the crown of Spain, what was to stop France and Spain from merging into one unstoppable empire? What would happen to the delicate equilibrium of Europe? And so the great powers aligned, not for or against Spain itself, but for the idea of Spain and who should control it. On one side stood France and Spain, united under Bourbon kinship. On the other, a coalition of old rivals and cautious neighbours: England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Prussia and Portugal. These were not light skirmishes. They were years of full-scale warfare, from the Low Countries to the Mediterranean, from the Italian plains to the fields of Bavaria. Philip V, as he was now called, was just 17 when he arrived in Madrid in 1701. He had soft, dark eyes and the poise of Versailles, but the Spanish court he entered was distant from the glittering salons of France. It was austere, ceremonial, bound in silence and sorrow. The grandeur of empire remained, but it was wrapped in dust. Still, Philip accepted the role, solemnly and with resolve. His reign had begun, but his rule would wait. War enveloped the peninsula like a winter storm. Catalonia and Valencia, suspicious of a Bourbon king, threw their support behind the Habsburg pretender, Archduke Charles of Austria, whom the Allied coalition backed as the rightful king. The war, thus, was not only European, it was also civil. Spanish fought Spanish, town fought town, brother fought brother. For more than a decade, fire and blood traced new borders across the land. In 1704, the British captured Gibraltar, a rocky fortress at the edge of the Iberian world. It would never be returned. In 1705, Allied forces entered Barcelona, and the city raised the banner of Charles III. But victories flickered. For every gain, there was a loss. The war dragged on, neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. Meanwhile, in Madrid, Philip remained a symbol of Bourbon resolve. He wrote letters in a fine hand, prayed with gravity, and awaited news from distant fronts. His wife, Maria Louisa of Savoy, young, energetic, and fiercely loyal, became his closest confidant and advisor. She stood beside him as generals came and went, as cities fell and rose, as rumours surged. Then in 1711, fate intervened in a way no one had predicted. Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor and older brother to Archduke Charles, died unexpectedly. Charles, the Austrian pretender to the Spanish throne, was now also heir to the imperial crown. The allies who had supported him to prevent the union of France and Spain now faced the possibility of a Habsburg super-empire of their own creation. Suddenly, peace seemed preferable to victory. One by one, the great powers withdrew. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. It was a tangle of compromises, but its heart was clear. Philip V would remain King of Spain, but he and his descendants must renounce all claims to the French throne. Spain would not become an extension of Versailles. The empires would remain separate, but the price was steep. Spain was forced to cede vast territories. Austria gained the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan and Sardinia. Britain kept Gibraltar and acquired the island of Minorca. Spain's empire, once immense and seemingly eternal, had been amputated. Catalonia held out until 1714, when Barcelona finally fell after a brutal siege. The city was punished harshly. Its institutions were dismantled, its language and autonomy suppressed. The new Bourbon monarchy was not only victorious, it was transformative. Philip V now began to remake Spain in his own image, with French style and central authority. The old decentralized kingdoms were merged into a singular identity. Castile became dominant. The Aragonese institutions were dismantled. The crown was no longer a collection of crowns, it was one. Philip brought reforms, new taxes, centralized ministries, a standing army. He encouraged trade, tried to revive industry, and fostered alliances through marriage. He created academies of language and science. He ruled not with the inherited weight of tradition, but with the strategic vision of modern kingship, filtered through Bourbon absolutism. And yet, for all his efforts, Philip was no mirror of Louis XIV. He suffered from melancholy, sudden depressions, long silences. He would retreat from court for days, even weeks. His second wife, Elizabeth Farnese of Parma, strong, intelligent and politically shrewd, took increasing control of the court and its policies, especially as Philip's health declined. They had many children, and Elizabeth saw in them the chance to regain what Spain had lost. She orchestrated marriages and wars in Italy to secure duchies and thrones for her sons. Spain would no longer rule the world, but it would plant roots wherever it could. Philip abdicated in 1724 in favour of his eldest son, Louis I. But Louis died after only 7 months on the throne, a victim of smallpox. Grief-stricken and shaken, Philip resumed the crown. He would rule until 1746. His reign had begun in the crucible of European war, yet he left a Spain more stable than he had found. The empire was smaller, the throne more secure, and the monarchy redefined, no longer medieval and fragmented, but central, absolute and modern. Let us leave him here for now. Philip V, first of the Spanish Bourbons, walking the gardens of La Granja, his eyes shadowed, his soul burdened by memories of war and the ghosts of kings. We'll return to meet the heirs of this new dynasty, the sons of a reshaped Spain, and the next chapter in the long, uneasy balance between tradition and reform. When Philip V died in 1746, Spain exhaled, not in celebration, but in stillness. The long, heavy reign of the first Bourbon king had ended. The crown now passed to his son, Ferdinand VI, a monarch gentler in disposition, quieter in ambition, and drawn not to conquest or reform, but to peace. It was a pause in Spain's long march of turbulence, a reign of breathing space, of soft voices in candlelit halls, and of trying, however briefly, to mend the seams left torn by war. Ferdinand VI had grown up in a court wrapped in shadows. His mother, Maria Louisa of Savoy, had died when he was just 7. His father's bouts of melancholy and withdrawal had taught him that kingship was not only public duty, but also private burden. He had seen the pomp and the pain. When his time came, he resolved to rule with reason, not force. He inherited a realm that had finally known some stability. The War of the Spanish Succession was over. Treaties had been signed. The map had changed. Spain had lost territories, yes, but it had gained a new structure, centralized, efficient and modernizing under Bourbon absolutism. The state functioned more smoothly, the bureaucracy more uniformly. The thorns remained, but the garden had been trimmed. Ferdinand's queen, Barbara of Portugal, was his anchor. Their love was not just ceremonial. It was deep, affectionate, quiet. They played music together in the evenings. Ferdinand on the keyboard, Barbara on the harp. The palace, so often a theatre of scheming and noise, became under their care a place of calm. The king appointed capable ministers who prioritised internal stability. Chief among them was the Marquis of Ensenada, a brilliant reformer who sought to update Spain's economy, streamline the navy, and encourage colonial development. Trade with the Americas expanded, roads were improved. Taxes were adjusted, often with care and consultation. Ensenada believed in a strong, centralised monarchy guided by Enlightenment principles, though cautiously applied. Ferdinand, while not a man of great speeches, supported these efforts. He was devout, but not fanatical, cautious, but not paralysed. He sought peace above all. Under his reign, Spain stayed out of the War of the Austrian Succession, a European conflict that might have tempted other monarchs to seek glory. But Ferdinand had seen too much of glory's cost. He maintained neutrality, cultivating diplomatic ties with both France and Britain. Yet even in peace, the past lingered. The old rivalry with Britain flared at sea. Spanish ships clashed with British traders and smugglers along the Atlantic routes. Though no formal war erupted, tensions simmered. Ensenada, ever the strategist, proposed military build-ups and economic defences. Spain began quietly strengthening its navy, not for conquest but for dignity. In the Americas, the Bourbon reforms, launched under Philip V and expanded under Ferdinand, took root. These aimed to tighten royal control over colonial administrations, reduce the power of local elites, and increase revenues. Viceroyalties were reorganised, new governors were appointed. The crown, more than ever, sought to pull its distant colonies closer. But Ferdinand's Spain was not just administrative, it was also artistic. The king patronised music, architecture and science. He founded the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando in Madrid. He supported astronomical observatories and libraries. He brought Enlightenment ideas into the softly lit salons of court, though always within the bounds of faith and tradition. It was in many ways a reign of gentle restoration, like tending a grand ancient tapestry, trying to stitch quietly what war and neglect had frayed. But such stillness could not last. In 1758, Queen Barbara fell ill. Her decline was slow, her suffering great. Ferdinand, inconsolable, withdrew from all public affairs. When she died later that year, something in him unravelled. The music ceased. The court fell silent. The king entered a state of mourning so deep it became a form of living death. He rarely spoke. He wore black constantly. He wandered the gardens of the palace, speaking to no one, his eyes hollow. Ministers continued to govern, but the king's light had dimmed. In 1759, barely a year after his beloved wife's passing, Ferdinand VI died, childless and broken by grief. His reign had lasted 13 years, brief, uneventful in the eyes of history's drums, yet essential in its stillness. Spain had rested, the wounds had scabbed, the reforms had taken root, the storm had not returned, not yet. The crown now passed to Charles, Ferdinand's half-brother. A king forged in Naples, a man of action, reform and boldness. The quiet years were over, a new wind was rising. Let us leave Ferdinand here, beneath the soft arches of the palace he adored, the music of his youth echoing faintly in stone halls, the memory of a love that had defined a reign of peace. Next we will follow Charles III, the enlightened despot, as he lifts Spain into a new age of reason, reform and modernity. When Charles III arrived in Spain to assume the throne in 1759, he did not come as a boy king, nor as a stranger to governance. He was 43 years old, seasoned by decades of rule in Italy, first as Duke of Parma, then as King of Naples and Sicily. His reputation preceded him, a capable reformer, practical, energetic, and infused with the spirit of the Enlightenment. Spain, so long weighed down by ceremony and inertia, was about to awaken. Charles was not the kind of monarch who delighted in lavish courts or baroque distractions. His mind was that of a planner, structured, rational, relentlessly focused on improvement. He dressed plainly. He walked with a quick, forward-leaning stride. He scorned idle chatter and tolerated no flattery. Where others saw the palace as a stage, Charles saw it as a workroom. The Spain he inherited was still rich in tradition and territory, but stagnant, its institutions bloated, its cities crumbling, its people increasingly distant from the grandeur they were meant to serve. Charles believed that the crown's purpose was not to rule through spectacle, but through service. His first mission was to surround himself with reform-minded ministers. Among the most prominent were the Count of Aranda, a sharp-minded Aragonese noble, the Marquis of Esquilache, a Neapolitan import and economist, and later, José Moñino, the Count of Florida Blanca. These men, alongside the king, would become the architects of Spain's Enlightenment, cautious, Catholic, and uniquely Spanish. The changes came quickly. He reformed the tax system, seeking equity in a kingdom long divided between noble privilege and peasant burden. He streamlined administrative divisions, strengthened the power of the crown, and modernized the legal code. The postal system was expanded. A national census was conducted, the first in Spanish history. Public health initiatives took shape. Hospitals were built, roads were paved and lit. Madrid, long a dusty and chaotic capital, began to transform into a city of order, dignity, and function. Charles saw public works not as luxuries but as necessities. Canals, bridges, drainage systems all were given royal priority. Urban cleanliness became a royal cause. He famously declared that a clean city reflects a clean conscience. To enforce this, he even passed regulations on street sweeping and sewage disposal. He launched massive beautification efforts in Madrid, opening public parks, renovating plazas, and erecting statues not just of saints and kings, but of thinkers and civic heroes. Yet not all change came easily. In 1766, resistance to reform flared in a sudden and startling way. The Esquilache riots, named after the unpopular minister whose foreign origins and wardrobe reforms made him a target, broke out in Madrid and spread across the country. What began as opposition to the banning of traditional wide-brimmed hats and capes, which officials feared allowed criminals to hide weapons and identities, turned into a broader expression of rage against rising food prices, foreign influence, and centralized power. Charles was shocked, but not broken. He dismissed Esquilache to calm the crowds, but pressed forward with his reforms. The riots only deepened his resolve. Spain needed education, order, and discipline. In their aftermath, Charles turned to native-born ministers and intensified efforts to modernize the state. He saw the incident not as a failure of policy, but a failure of communication. The people needed to understand their government, not just obey it. One of Charles's boldest moves came in 1767. The expulsion of the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus, long a powerful force in Spanish education and theology, was accused by Charles's ministers of sowing dissent and resisting reform. Without warning, Jesuit schools and missions were shut down. Thousands of priests were deported to the Papal States. The decision shocked much of Catholic Europe, but Charles stood firm. He believed no group, not even one within the Church, should be allowed to rival royal authority. Abroad, Charles pursued a restrained but assertive foreign policy. He aligned Spain with France under the so-called Family Compact, a Bourbon alliance that brought the two kingdoms into war against Britain during the latter stages of the 7 Years' War. Spain lost Havana and Manila temporarily, but regained them in the peace. More notably, Charles entered the American Revolutionary War on the side of the American colonies, not out of love for republicanism, but to strike at Britain and reclaim lost prestige. Spanish forces captured British forts in Florida and along the Mississippi. Though Spain was not present at the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, it emerged from the war with territorial gains and renewed maritime confidence. In the colonies, Charles extended his reforms. The Bourbon reforms, administrative, economic, and ecclesiastical, aimed to tighten control over the Spanish Americas. He sent new viceroys, restructured trade, and reduced the power of local elites. But resistance brewed. Creole resentment of peninsular authority would smoulder quietly, waiting for future sparks. As he aged, Charles grew no less determined, but his body slowed. His health began to decline in the late 1780s. His beloved wife, Maria Amalia of Saxony, had died years earlier, and though Charles never remarried, her memory remained with him, quiet, unadorned, but enduring. In 1788, Charles III died after nearly 30 years on the throne. His legacy was not one of wars won or grand cathedrals built. It was a quieter triumph, the reshaping of a kingdom into a modern state. Spain was no longer merely a remnant of past glory. It was, for a brief and brilliant moment, part of the Enlightenment, disciplined, rational, and forward-looking. Let us remember him here, a king in plain dress, walking through a park he had opened to the public, nodding at the workers who laid stone for the city's new street lamps, always thinking, always reforming, always with one foot in the old world and one in the new. Next, we will enter the reign of his son, Charles IV, and watch as the steady ground begins once again to tremble. When Charles IV inherited the Spanish crown in 1788, he stepped into shoes both well-fitted and heavy with expectation. His father, Charles III, had reigned with clarity, resolve, and enlightenment purpose. But Charles IV was a different kind of man, good-hearted, courteous, but indecisive. He loved hunting more than governing, and found greater comfort in the solitude of forests than the chambers of council. He was tall, broad, with gentle eyes and a natural warmth, but lacked the intellect and drive of his predecessors. Where Charles III had ruled with energy, his son preferred delegation. His reign, stretching into one of Europe's most turbulent eras, would be defined not by his own hand, but by those who surrounded him, and by the storms that tore through the continent. Beside him stood Maria Luisa of Parma, his queen, and behind her, a man who would come to dominate Spain's politics and fate, Manuel Godoy. Godoy was young, handsome, and ambitious, a member of the royal guard who rose rapidly through favour, charm, and, many whispered, the affection of the queen. He became First Secretary of State by 1792, barely 30 years old. Critics dubbed him El Príncipe de la Paz, the Prince of Peace, a title won after brokering a treaty with revolutionary France, though it was often spoken with irony rather than admiration. Godoy wielded immense power, and Charles IV, content to retreat into his hobbies, allowed it. While the king played violin or pursued deer, Godoy signed decrees, managed ministers, and navigated a world falling apart. For beyond Spain's borders, the world was indeed in flames. In 1789, a wave broke over France, the French Revolution. The Bourbon monarchy there was toppled, and in 1793, Louis XVI, cousin to Charles IV, was executed by guillotine. The image of a king's severed head shook every throne in Europe. Monarchs whispered in candlelit chambers. Revolution had proven contagious. The old world was at risk. Spain joined the first coalition against the French Republic, but military failure and internal instability soon forced a change in course. Godoy, pragmatic and self-preserving, signed the Peace of Basel in 1795. Spain made peace with France, ceding Santo Domingo, but avoiding further entanglement. For the moment. Then came the alliance. Under the Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain allied itself with Napoleon Bonaparte's France. Godoy, ever the survivor, shifted with the tides. But alliances with Napoleon came at a price. Spain was drawn into wars it did not start, and battles it could not win. In 1805, the Spanish fleet joined the French at Trafalgar. The result was disaster. Off the coast of Cadiz, Admiral Horatio Nelson led the British Royal Navy to a crushing victory. Though Nelson himself died in battle, his fleet annihilated the Franco-Spanish Armada. Spain's naval power, once the pride of an empire, was shattered. Its Atlantic influence, its ability to protect its American colonies, and its strategic standing evaporated in a single bloody afternoon. Back in Madrid, dissatisfaction simmered. Godoy's unpopularity grew. He was blamed for the military defeats, for the increasing economic strain, for the erosion of royal dignity. The court grew tense, and in the shadows of palaces a new figure emerged. Ferdinand, Prince of Asturias, Charles IV's son. Ferdinand was impatient, proud, and hungry for the crown. He resented Godoy's influence and his father's passivity. Factions formed around him, noblemen, generals, clergy, each hoping to restore Spain's honour by bringing the prince to power. It was not an open rebellion, but it was close. Meanwhile, Napoleon watched. The Emperor of France saw Spain not as a partner, but as a pawn. The alliance was useful only so far as it served his own imperial design. In 1807, under the Treaty of Fontainebleau, France and Spain agreed to a joint invasion of Portugal, one of Britain's closest allies. French troops entered Spain under the guise of friendship, but they did not stop. Soon French garrisons appeared in key cities. Napoleon's intentions grew clearer. In March 1808, a popular uprising erupted in Aranjuez. The people rose against Godoy. His palace was stormed. He was arrested. The riot was swift, furious, and victorious. Godoy had fallen. Under pressure from all sides, Charles IV abdicated, not with dignity, but in defeat. Ferdinand VII, his son, now took the crown. The court sighed with relief. The hated minister was gone. The weak king had stepped aside. Perhaps now Spain could rise again. But the story was not finished. It was just beginning. In a masterstroke of deceit, Napoleon invited both Charles IV and Ferdinand VII to the French city of Bayonne. There, under diplomatic pretenses, he cornered them. He forced Charles to renounce all rights. He coerced Ferdinand into abdication, and then in their place he appointed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. It was treachery disguised as diplomacy. Spain had been seized, not conquered. The Spanish people erupted. Across towns and villages, uprisings exploded. In Madrid, on May 2nd, 1808, a spontaneous revolt turned the streets into battlegrounds. French troops responded with brutality. The following day, hundreds of Spaniards were executed. Francisco Goya, the court painter, would immortalize the horror in haunting images of wide eyes, raised arms, blood-soaked cobblestones. The Peninsular War had begun. Let us linger here, with Goya's silent witnesses to suffering, and with a nation awakening from its long royal slumber into fire. The Bourbon crown had fallen, but the spirit of Spain had risen. Next, we will follow this resistance into the heart of a people's war, a king in exile, and the first flickers of modern Spanish identity. Spain, in the spring of 1808, was a nation under siege, not only by armies, but by betrayal. A foreign king now sat upon its throne, imposed by the will of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose soldiers marched through cities as both guests and conquerors. Joseph Bonaparte, brother to the emperor, once a lawyer and diplomat, was crowned King Joseph I of Spain. But he wore the crown like borrowed clothes, ill-fitting and unwanted. The Spanish people did not rise in unison at first. Their anger was not organized, it was instinctual. From the streets of Madrid to the valleys of Asturias, the insult of foreign rule sparked rebellion in the hearts of farmers, priests, artisans, and even the remnants of the nobility. It was not the regular army that moved first, but the people, ragged, enraged, armed with whatever they could find. The uprising of May 2nd in Madrid, known as Dos de Mayo, became the symbol of resistance. French troops, brutal and efficient, crushed the riot and executed hundreds the following day. But the fires had been lit. Word spread fast. Across Spain, provinces declared juntas, independent governing bodies in the name of the absent Ferdinand VII. They refused to recognize Joseph as king. They summoned militias, forged alliances, and, for the first time in centuries, the Spanish people began to act not for a monarch, but for a nation. Thus began the Peninsular War, a brutal, sprawling conflict that would rage for 6 years. The French believed their military superiority would bring a swift end, but they found themselves facing a different kind of enemy. The Spanish terrain, mountainous, remote, inhospitable, became a weapon. Villagers became saboteurs, priests became messengers, women passed information in baskets of bread, children poisoned wells. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, was born in these years, the fight of the few against the many. The French response was vicious. Towns were burned, civilians were massacred, but for every crackdown, new resistance arose. French soldiers accustomed to formal battles now faced ambushes on narrow trails and blades in the night. In the north and west, British forces under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, landed to assist. They brought discipline, supplies, and strategy. The alliance between the British and Spanish irregulars was uneasy at times, but effective. Together they struck at the French from Galicia to Andalusia. Meanwhile, in the city of Cadiz, a sunlit fortified port, the last unoccupied stronghold of the Spanish government in exile took shape. There, under the protection of British ships and local defence, a new idea began to flicker, a constitution. The Cortes of Cadiz convened in 1810. It was a gathering of exiled deputies, nobles, clergy, lawyers and scholars, all bound by the belief that Spain needed to be reborn, not simply rescued from the French, but remade. They debated for months. Should the king return as absolute monarch? Or should the people hold sovereignty? Could liberalism and Catholic tradition coexist? In 1812, as French troops still marched through the heart of Spain, the Cortes ratified a new constitution. It declared the Spanish nation as sovereign. It promised equality under law, freedom of the press, and limited monarchy. It was one of the most progressive charters of its time. They called it La Pepa, a term of endearment whispered even in secret. And it became the soul of a new Spain waiting to be born. but not all welcomed it. Conservatives, loyalists, and absolutists watched with unease. The divide between old and new Spain deepened, even as the French grip loosened. Napoleon, facing growing resistance and overextended across Europe, began to falter. In 1813, after suffering heavy losses in Russia and battles in Germany, he withdrew much of his strength from Spain. Joseph Bonaparte, weary and beaten, fled Madrid. French forces retreated step by step, harassed all the way by guerrillas and Anglo-Spanish troops. By the end of 1813, the French occupation was all but over. Spain, bruised but unbroken, had expelled the invader. In 1814, Ferdinand VII was restored to the throne. The people expected him to return as a constitutional monarch, to honour La Pepa, the sacrifices made in his name, the blood shed for freedom. But Ferdinand had learned little in exile. He returned not as a humbled king, but as an avenger. He annulled the Constitution of 1812, dissolved the Cortes, and restored absolute monarchy. Liberal leaders were imprisoned or exiled. Printing presses were shuttered. The old regime returned, weary, suspicious, rigid. The dream of reform faded under the weight of royal decree. Spain had won a war, but lost a chance. And yet something had changed. The taste of sovereignty once known cannot be forgotten. The memory of La Pepa, the spirit of Cadiz, the fire of resistance, these would smoulder beneath the surface of Spanish life for years to come. Let us leave Spain here, for now, caught between two worlds, one of ancient crowns and divine right, the other of revolution and rights of man. Ferdinand ruled, but the ground beneath him had shifted. Next we'll follow his troubled reign, through uprisings, betrayals, and the slow, painful unravelling of empire across the seas. When Ferdinand VII resumed his throne in 1814, he returned not as a saviour, but as a sovereign steeped in old convictions. The war had been fought in his name, but not for his ideals. Spain's people, weary and bloodied from years of resistance, had dared to imagine something beyond monarchy, a land governed by law, by liberty, by the voice of its own citizens. But Ferdinand did not come back to honour the Constitution of Cadiz. He came back to erase it. His first act was swift and final. He declared the Constitution of 1812 null and void. The Cortes was dissolved, the printing presses silenced, political clubs shuttered. The liberal leaders who had carried the dream of a modern Spain were imprisoned or exiled. El Deseado, the desired one as the people had called him in hopeful absence, now became El Rey Felon, the treacherous king. In a single breath, he returned Spain to absolutism. The next years were marked by reaction, not just in policy, but in spirit. Ferdinand surrounded himself with courtiers and clerics who reinforced his belief that monarchy, ordained by God, must never yield to the will of the people. Censorship tightened. The Inquisition, though officially suppressed under pressure from abroad, found new life in the spirit of repression. Spain, which had tasted the winds of the Enlightenment, was returned to the still air of the old order. But the world beyond continued to move. Across the Atlantic, in the vast expanse of Spain's American empire, the effects of the Peninsular War and the temporary vacuum of royal authority had sparked something irreversible. The colonies, from Mexico to Argentina, had begun to drift. At first they claimed loyalty to Ferdinand, resisting French rule. But when the king rejected the constitution and reasserted absolute power, their loyalty faltered. The promises of Cadiz echoed louder than the commands of Madrid. One by one, the Spanish colonies rose. Revolution spread through the Americas, not as a coordinated wave, but as an awakening. Leaders like Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Miguel Hidalgo challenged Spanish authority with new flags, new ideals, and armed rebellion. Some of these uprisings were brutally suppressed. Others succeeded, carving out new republics from the bones of empire. By the early 1820s, Spain had lost nearly all of its American possessions. Only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and a few scattered islands remained. The empire that had once stretched from California to Cape Horn was gone, dissolved in less than a decade, not by foreign conquest, but by internal neglect and ideological rigidity. Back in Spain, dissent began to rise once more. In 1820, a young officer named Rafael del Riego led a garrison revolt in Andalusia. His demands were simple, the restoration of the Constitution of 1812. The movement spread quickly. Soldiers, students, and townspeople joined him. The king, caught off guard, was forced to yield. La Pepa was reborn, For 3 years, Spain entered a new phase, the Trienio Liberal. It was a fragile experiment. The Liberals tried to revive reforms, to decentralize power, to revive freedoms. But Ferdinand, though publicly submissive, privately plotted. He appealed to Europe's conservative powers, to the newly formed Holy Alliance, a group of monarchies committed to suppressing revolution wherever it appeared. In 1823, French troops once again marched into Spain, this time at Ferdinand's request. They came not as invaders but as restorers. The so-called 100,000 Sons of St. Louis entered with minimal resistance. The liberal regime crumbled. Ferdinand, once more enthroned as absolute monarch, exacted revenge. Executions followed. Riego himself was hanged. The constitution was buried again. This second absolutist phase, from 1823 to 1833, was more bitter, more paranoid. The king aged into suspicion. He married 4 times, desperate for an heir. His 4th wife, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, finally bore him 2 daughters. But this created a new crisis. The traditional Spanish succession laws favoured male heirs. Yet Ferdinand, determined to secure the crown for his infant daughter Isabella, issued the Pragmatic Sanction in 1830, revoking the Salic law that barred female succession. His brother, Don Carlos, protested. So did many conservatives and traditionalists. The seeds of civil war were sown. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, his daughter Isabella II was just 3 years old. Maria Cristina assumed the regency, but Don Carlos, refusing to accept the girl's claim, declared himself the rightful king. Spain would now be torn, not by foreign armies or distant colonies, but by its own blood. The Carlist Wars, civil conflicts born of succession, ideology, and the clash between tradition and progress, were about to begin. Let us pause here, with the funeral bell tolling for Ferdinand VI, a king who ruled not with vision, but with refusal. His Spain was one of reversals and repression, of lost empires and broken promises. He had survived revolution, but had not escaped its consequences. In the next chapter, we'll walk into the fires of civil war and follow the child Queen Isabella as she is swept into a storm not of her own making, yet destined to define her reign. The year was 1833, and Spain once more stood on a precipice. King Ferdinand VII was dead, but peace did not follow him into the grave. In his place stood a child, Isabella II, only 3 years old, crowned by the will of her father and protected by her mother, Maria Cristina, who would now rule as regent. Yet around them swirled uncertainty, bitterness, and rebellion. The kingdom had not truly agreed to be ruled by a girl, nor by the Queen Mother who acted in her name. From the north, from the misted mountains of the Basque country and the rugged lands of Navarre, a challenge emerged, not merely to Isabella's claim, but to the very soul of Spain. Don Carlos, brother of the late king, refused to recognize the Pragmatic Sanction that allowed female succession. He declared himself Carlos Farth, rightful king of Spain, and rallied those who still clung to the old order, to tradition, absolutism, and the divine right of monarchs. His followers, known as Carlists, were deeply rooted in rural Spain, in the conservative heartlands where ancient customs still ruled and central authority was viewed with suspicion. Thus began the First Carlist War, not just a war of succession, but a brutal, ideological civil war. On one side stood the Carlists, royalists, traditionalists, and defenders of the fueros, the historic regional privileges and autonomy especially cherished in the Basque provinces. On the other stood the Cristinos or Isabelinos, supporters of the regency, liberals, moderates, and constitutionalists who believed in the monarchy, but one bounded by law and reform. The war, which would drag on for 7 years, was waged through ambushes, sieges, and skirmishes across the Spanish countryside. There were no clear battle lines, only shifting allegiances and long columns of smoke rising from ruined villages. Both sides committed atrocities. Families were divided, sons fought fathers, towns changed hands multiple times. Spain bled from within. Don Carlos himself was a figure of unwavering certainty, austere, devout, and unyielding. He inspired deep loyalty, especially among the clergy and peasantry, but he also alienated potential allies with his rigidity. Maria Cristina, for her part, proved more politically agile than many expected. She surrounded herself with pragmatic ministers and aligned with moderate liberals who could bolster her authority and stabilize the crown. In 1837, as the war raged on, a new constitution was drafted. more moderate than that of 1812, but still a significant step toward modern governance. It attempted to strike a balance, preserving the monarchy but granting power to elected representatives, defining rights and reining in royal absolutism. It was a cautious step toward liberalism, born of necessity. On the battlefield, General Baldomero Espartero emerged as the crown's most capable commander. Ruthless and strategic, he secured key victories in the north and slowly wore down the Carlist resistance. In 1839, the Convention of Vergara was signed. Many Carlist officers, recognizing the war was lost, agreed to lay down their arms in exchange for guarantees of regional privileges and amnesty. Don Carlos fled to France, defeated but unrepentant. Spain exhaled, but not deeply. Peace brought no unity. The divisions that had fueled the war remained embedded in Spanish life. In Madrid, liberal and conservative factions jostled for influence. Maria Cristina, increasingly unpopular with radicals and military leaders alike, abdicated the regency in 1840, yielding power to Espartero himself. The general became regent in all but name, a soldier-statesman governing in the vacuum of royal authority. But Espartero's reign as regent was short-lived. His authoritarian tendencies and inability to navigate court politics alienated many. In 1843, just 3 years later, he was forced into exile. And in a swift, decisive act, the Cortes declared that Queen Isabella II, then only 13, had reached the age of majority. A child had become a queen. A girl raised in palaces ringed by war was now expected to rule a nation in turmoil. Her early reign was shaped not by her will, but by the men who surrounded her, generals, ministers, nobles, and courtiers. They governed in her name, but with their own agendas. Factionalism tore through every government. Cabinets rose and fell with alarming speed. One moment the moderates were in control, favouring centralisation and conservatism. The next, the progressives took over, pushing for greater liberties and reform. Isabella, for her part, was intelligent, instinctive and politically aware, but her personal life soon overshadowed her rule. Pressured into a loveless marriage with her cousin, Francis of Assisi, their union was plagued by scandal and distance. Rumours swirled through the salons of Madrid, of affairs, of illegitimacy, of intrigue. The Queen's image suffered. She was mocked, criticised and doubted, even as she bore children and tried to assert her authority. Amid the chaos, Spain itself was changing. The Industrial Revolution crept across the land unevenly. Railroads appeared, new cities grew. A middle class began to emerge, educated, ambitious, increasingly political. Newspapers flourished, secret societies gathered in cafes and taverns. Old Spain, rural, monarchic and hierarchical, now faced a rising tide of modernity, sceptical of the crown and hungry for change. Yet even in this shifting world, the ghost of Carlism remained. Don Carlos had died in exile, but his son, Carlos VI, to his followers, took up the banner. Carlist sentiment smouldered in the north, waiting for the moment to ignite again. Let us pause here in the uncertain light of Isabella's early reign, a time of uneasy peace, shallow governments, and a queen not yet fully queen. Spain stood between its past and future, a country still torn by what it had been and what it was trying to become. Soon the fire would return, and with it another war, another king in exile, another reckoning. The middle years of Queen Isabella II's reign were marked not by triumph, but by turbulence. A kingdom perpetually on the verge of conflict, staggering from one crisis to the next, like a ship refusing to capsize yet incapable of finding calm waters. She was queen in name, but the throne beneath her feet trembled with every shift in political wind, and the crown upon her head often weighed more heavily than she could bear. By the 1850s, Isabella was no longer a child, though many in the court still treated her as one, or worse, as a pawn. Her early attempts to assert control were met with resistance from the men who had grown used to ruling through her. Ministers came and went with dizzying speed. Coups were whispered in corridors and hatched in barracks. The army, more than the parliament, remained the true arbiter of power. Generals made and unmade governments. Their loyalty was not to the constitution, nor to the people, but to their own ambitions. And yet the machinery of the state kept turning. Spain in these years existed in a strange duality, politically unstable yet slowly modernizing. Railways stretched across the plains, telegraph wires hummed with silent messages. Trade expanded, banking evolved, cities swelled. A new generation of Spaniards came of age in a Spain that looked more like France or Britain, but beneath this modern facade, the soul of the nation remained divided. In the north, the Carlists stirred again. The Second Carlist War erupted in 1846, though it was more limited in scale than the first. It began under the pretext of dynastic claims. The Carlists insisted that Isabella's marriage was invalid and thus her reign illegitimate. But at its heart, the war was fueled by the same age-old grievances: rural against urban, traditionalist against liberal, faith against reform. It was a flicker, not a blaze, but it reminded all that Spain's wounds had never truly healed. The fighting was sporadic. Bands of Carlist fighters clashed with government troops in Catalonia and the Basque provinces. Villages were raided. Roads became dangerous. Yet the conflict lacked the fervour of the earlier war. The Carlist cause had weakened, its leadership fragmented, and its popular support eroded by the slow march of progress. By 1849, the rebellion had petered out, but its shadow remained. Isabella's court, meanwhile, became a theatre of scandal. Her marriage to Francis of Assisi was a union of convenience, orchestrated for political necessity and dynastic purity. But affection never grew between them. Francis was soft-spoken, introverted, and widely rumoured to be disinterested in women altogether. Isabella, fiery and impetuous, took lovers, discreetly at first, then with increasing openness. The court gossiped in hushed tones. The press, emboldened by new freedoms, hinted at improprieties. The line between personal and political blurred. Yet even in this storm of intrigue and unrest, Isabella gave birth to heirs. In 1851 she bore a son, Alfonso, whom she named Prince of Asturias. The boy became a symbol of continuity, even as whispers about his true paternity floated through the salons. Still, the monarchy endured. Through tradition, ritual and inertia, it persisted. By the late 1850s, a temporary stability emerged. A group of moderate party leaders, supported by the military, managed to consolidate power. One such leader, General Leopoldo O'Donnell, would become a central figure in this period. He was ambitious, pragmatic, and skilled at navigating the shifting tides of Madrid's politics. Under his leadership, Spain entered a phase of cautious expansion and renewed nationalism. In 1859, O'Donnell led Spain into the Hispano-Moroccan War, a brief but symbolic campaign in North Africa. Spanish forces captured the city of Tetuan and returned in triumph. It was a rare moment of unity, a reminder, if only momentary, of Spain's imperial past and military prowess. The war was short, the cost modest, and the victory welcomed, but the unity it inspired did not last. Factions returned. The progressives pushed for more radical reforms. Republicans whispered in the wings. Social unrest began to stir as industrial workers, concentrated in Barcelona and other cities, began demanding rights and representation. The church, once the moral anchor of the monarchy, was increasingly at odds with a government that flirted with secularism. Confiscations of ecclesiastical property continued. Education was pulled from clerical hands. Bishops protested. Priests fumed. Isabella vacillated between moderates and conservatives, between piety and modernity, between a desire to rule and a desire to retreat. Her indecision bred instability. Her favour shifted quickly, rewarding loyalty one day, punishing dissent the next. Ministers no longer governed Spain. They merely passed through it. By the 1860s, disillusionment had spread. Republicans called for the end of monarchy. Liberals demanded a new constitution. Even within the army, long a pillar of royal support, discontent took root. The generals who once protected the throne now began to question its occupant. And yet Isabella ruled on. Not with strength, but with habit. Not with love, but with tradition. Spain, so often driven by a longing for stability, had learned to live with dysfunction. The Queen presided over ceremonies, received ambassadors, signed decrees, but the ground beneath her continued to crack. Let us rest for a moment in these waning years of Isabella's troubled reign, a time of unfinished reforms, whispered betrayals, and a queen clinging to a crown that no longer fit. The monarchy had survived wars, coups, and scandal. But the storm ahead would not be weathered so easily. In the next chapter, the skies will darken. A revolution will rise. And Isabella, daughter of a contested throne, will find herself cast into exile. By the dawn of the 1860s, the atmosphere around Queen Isabella II had thickened. It was no longer mere discontent, it was a gathering storm. Her reign, once buoyed by tradition and inertia, now stood as a symbol of everything that Spain had failed to become. Her government was unstable, her court scandal-ridden, her rule erratic and often indulgent. The whispers of reform had grown into voices, and soon those voices would become the roar of revolution. The country itself pulsed with contradiction. In the countryside, many still clung to traditional values and monarchy. In the cities, however, modernity crept in. Factories, printing presses, newspapers, workers' clubs, intellectual salons. Railways stitched together regions that had once existed in relative isolation. With them came new ideas, liberalism, socialism, republicanism, each challenging the old structure of throne and altar. Politically, Isabella had alienated nearly everyone. Conservatives mistrusted her personal life and impulsive governance. Liberals accused her of betraying reform. Progressives, frozen out of government, plotted in shadows. Even the military, which had long served as her bulwark, began to drift. Generals once loyal to the crown now spoke openly of change. Some had already tasted the sweetness of power and sought it again. One of the final fractures came in 1866, when a military revolt erupted in Madrid, led by the sergeants of the San Gil barracks. The mutiny was quickly suppressed, but its message was clear. The foundations were shaking. The following year, discontent boiled over into the countryside. Protests flared in Catalonia and Andalusia. Economic downturns, food shortages and tax burdens gave the people new reasons to question the monarchy. Isabella, increasingly isolated, tried to hold the centre. She replaced ministers, then replaced their replacements. She summoned generals, then dismissed them. But the damage was deep. Her government had become a carousel, spinning but going nowhere. Meanwhile, a broad coalition of exiles, generals, intellectuals, and opposition leaders began to converge. They were monarchists and republicans, moderates and radicals, united not by a common vision of Spain's future, but by a shared conclusion that Isabella could no longer rule it. Among them were key figures. Juan Prim, a stern and charismatic general, Francisco Serrano, a seasoned military leader and political moderate, and exiled liberals like Praxedes Mateo Sagasta and Emilio Castelar. In 1868, the conspiracy matured into action. On September 18th, in the Bay of Cadiz, Admiral Juan Bautista Topete raised the flag of rebellion. The cry was, "Viva España con honra!" Long live Spain with honor. The phrase was carefully chosen. It was not yet a republican revolution, nor purely liberal. It was a movement for dignity, decency, and national renewal, and it quickly spread. Across the country, garrisons joined the rebels. Towns declared their allegiance. Crowds gathered in plazas to demand the Queen's abdication. Government forces, demoralized and disorganized, failed to offer meaningful resistance. Generals who had once defended the crown now stood in open defiance. The royal army collapsed, not in defeat, but in surrender. Isabella, vacationing in San Sebastian near the French border, received the news with disbelief. Her ministers urged her to resist, but the Queen had seen this coming, perhaps had even resigned herself to it. On September 30th, 1868, she crossed into France, escorted by a handful of loyalists. The Bourbon monarchy, once the axis of Spanish life, had been unseated. Her departure was not met with violence, nor with joy, but with a curious silence. After 35 years of rule, marked by war, scandal, and missed opportunity, Isabella II had vanished from the scene, and so Spain stood, suddenly monarchless. But it was not yet a republic, nor was it at peace. The revolutionaries, victorious but divided, convened a provisional government. They promised reforms, drafted a new constitution, and declared the nation a constitutional monarchy. Yet there was no monarch to sit on the throne. The search for a king, willing, acceptable, and untainted, would become the central riddle of the next years. Still, in that moment, Spain pulsed with possibility. Newspapers published freely, political clubs formed, workers organized, new voices emerged, female writers, secular thinkers, scientists, poets. It was a spring of sorts, fragile but sincere. And yet the wounds of the past still bled beneath the surface. Carlist claimants watched from exile. Republicans, impatient, whispered of full revolution. Anarchist ideas imported from abroad began to take root. The monarchy had fallen, but the question remained, what would rise in its place? Let us pause here as the smoke clears from revolution and the palace in Madrid sits empty. Spain stood at a crossroads, its crown in exile, its soul in flux. Soon the search for a new monarch would begin, and with it a new chapter of uncertainty, bold, brief, and ultimately broken. The palace was quiet. No footsteps echoed through its marbled halls. No royal banners fluttered from its balconies. For the first time in centuries, Spain's throne sat empty, not by design, but by revolt. In the wake of the glorious revolution of 1868, the monarchy had been swept aside, yet the desire for monarchy had not entirely vanished. Spain, restless and fractured, was not ready for a republic. Not yet. The provisional government, a blend of military generals, liberal intellectuals, and moderate statesmen, stood at the helm. General Francisco Serrano assumed leadership as regent, guiding the interim, while a new constitutional framework was devised. In 1869, a new constitution was ratified, one of the most liberal in Europe at the time. It declared national sovereignty, established universal male suffrage, and reinforced freedoms of the press, religion, and assembly. But at its core, it also preserved the monarchy, now constitutional and restrained, a crown beneath law. And so began the royal search. It was a bizarre and delicate enterprise, to find a king for a kingdom that had rejected its last queen. The challenge was immense. The candidate had to be acceptable to liberals and moderates, palatable to foreign powers, and preferably untainted by association with the Bourbons or the Carlists. Names were whispered across Europe: the Portuguese Duke of Porto, Prince Thomas of Savoy, even a young German Hohenzollern, Leopold, whose candidacy would later spark the Franco-Prussian War. But in 1870, after long deliberation and political manoeuvring, the Cortes settled on a quiet and curious figure: Amadeo of Savoy, the second son of King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy. Amadeo was 35, a veteran of the Italian Wars of Unification, and a prince raised in the new spirit of constitutional monarchy. He was seen as neutral, modern, and unburdened by Spanish political baggage, and he accepted. He arrived in Spain in December 1870, stepping off the ship at Cartagena into a country already teetering on the edge. As fate would have it, the very man who had championed his candidacy, General Juan Prim, was assassinated just days before the new king's arrival. Amadeo's first duty as monarch was to attend the funeral of his greatest supporter. It was an ominous beginning. From the start, Amadeo's reign was precarious. He was foreign. He spoke Spanish with effort. He had no natural base of support. Republicans scorned him as a symbol of monarchy. Carlists rejected him as illegitimate. Moderates viewed him with indifference, and his few supporters lacked the strength to defend him when the tides turned. The country he inherited was volatile. Regionalism flared, especially in Catalonia and the Basque Country, as demands for autonomy clashed with centralized authority. The economy struggled. Strikes spread through industrial centers. The working class, emboldened by socialist and anarchist ideas, grew increasingly radical. The church, alienated by liberal policies, withheld its full support. The army, divided and restive, grew resentful of civilian politicians. Meanwhile, a third Carlist war had erupted. Don Carlos, the grandson of the original pretender, proclaimed himself Carlos VII and launched a new campaign from the north. His forces, bolstered by rural clergy, peasants, and disillusioned monarchists, took towns and battled government troops across Navarre, Catalonia, and the Basque territories. The land groaned with the weight of old rivalries. Amadeo tried to govern with integrity. He toured the country. He listened. He attempted to reconcile factions, to reform institutions, to model moderation. But his efforts were drowned in the chaos. Cabinets fell one after another. No coalition could hold. Assassinations, riots, and political backstabbing surrounded the young monarchy like smoke around a candle flame. In February 1873, after just 2 years on the throne, Amadeo stood before the Cortes and renounced the crown. In his address, he spoke of Spain's ungovernability, not with bitterness, but with sorrow. He returned to Italy, where he lived out the rest of his days quietly, never again seeking power. And once again, the throne stood empty. But this time, no search began. The Cortes did not look abroad. It looked inward. On the very same day as Amadeo's abdication, February 11, 1873, Spain was declared a republic. It was the first in Spanish history, and though it lasted barely a year, it would set into motion forces that would ripple for generations. The monarchy was not abolished by force, but by resignation. The crown had been offered and returned. Let us pause here, in this strange moment of transition, a republic born not from revolution but from exhaustion. The halls of power filled with new voices, idealists, federalists, radicals, dreamers, each hoping to build a new Spain upon the ruins of the old. But unity would prove elusive, and the dream of a republic, like the crown before it, would soon begin to slip away. The first Spanish Republic, born on a February morning in 1873, emerged not from triumph, but from the resignation of a king and the weariness of a nation. Its birth was abrupt, a declaration without a revolution, a republic without a blueprint. It arrived like a guest no one expected, welcomed politely by some, warily by others, and outright rejected by many. At its heart, the republic was a fragile experiment, noble in ideals, but fractured in vision. Its founders included an uneasy alliance of federalists, Unitarians, moderates, radicals, and idealists. They agreed on the necessity of a republic, but on little else. Some dreamed of a centralized, secular republic like France. Others imagined a federation of autonomous regions, where provinces like Catalonia, Valencia, and Andalusia could govern themselves beneath a loose national banner. Between those two poles stretched a wide and treacherous chasm. The first president was Estanislao Figueras, a Catalan lawyer and staunch federalist. He took office with a deep sense of responsibility and a quiet dread of what lay ahead. The Republic inherited not only a divided parliament, but a country mired in war and disorder. The Carlist War still raged in the north. Don Carlos's forces, hardened and resolute, had taken strongholds and dug into the mountainous terrain. In the south, a different revolt brewed. This one not royalist, but radical. Inspired by anarchist and socialist thought and fueled by local grievances, a series of cantonal rebellions exploded across Andalusia and Murcia. In these cities, local committees declared independence from Madrid and established their own governments, the Cantonese. Cartagena, in particular, became a stronghold of the Cantonalists. Its defenders raised a red flag above the port and proclaimed a revolutionary council. Armed with warships and determination, they defied central authority for months. The Republic, caught between Carlist monarchists in the north and cantonal federalists in the south, found itself surrounded by enemies, with few allies and even fewer solutions. President Figueras, overwhelmed and increasingly isolated, resigned in despair after only a few months. As he left Madrid, he is said to have muttered, "I am sick of all of us." His words echoed the mood of a government unraveling. He was succeeded by Francisco P. Y. Margal, a philosopher, writer, and passionate federalist. P. Y. Margal believed deeply in the vision of a decentralized Spain, where freedom was nurtured at the local level, not imposed from the center. He tried to draft a federal constitution, balancing unity and autonomy. But the cantonal rebellions, wild and uncontrolled, consumed his vision. They were not expressions of thoughtful federalism, but bursts of local power, driven more by desperation than ideology. His efforts collapsed and he too resigned. Two more presidents followed in rapid succession. Nicolas Salmerón, who attempted to restore order and maintain republican legality, but resigned rather than sign death warrants for rebellious soldiers, and then Emilio Castelar, a brilliant orator and firm believer in a strong central republic. Castelar, in contrast to his predecessors, suspended civil liberties and governed by decree. He called for discipline, hierarchy, and law, believing that only a strong hand could save the republic from total collapse. Under his brief rule, the army regained some ground. Cartagena was besieged and eventually fell. The Carlists were pushed back, but the cost was high, and the political backlash immediate. In January 1874, Castelar lost a parliamentary vote of confidence. Before a new government could be formed, General Manuel Pavia, disgusted by the disarray, marched troops into the Cortes and forcibly dissolved the chamber. There was no bloodshed, but the First Republic, already dying, was now effectively dead. What followed was not a return to monarchy, nor a fully declared dictatorship, but a strange, transitory phase. General Francisco Serrano, the same man who had once served as regent before Amadeo's arrival, now ruled as a quasi-dictator, maintaining order while waiting for a more permanent solution. The Republicans, exhausted and divided, faded into the background. The dream had collapsed, not from invasion or revolution, but from within. Meanwhile in Paris, a boy watched and waited. Alfonso, the teenage son of Isabella II, had grown up in exile. He had been educated in Austria and England, and now, with the First Republic in ruins, monarchists saw in him a chance to restore stability, to bring back the Bourbon crown, but perhaps with constitutional reforms and a new, modern image. In December 1874, a young general named Arsenio Martinez Campos launched a pronunciamiento, a traditional military proclamation, in the city of Sagunto, declaring Alfonso XII King of Spain. The army rallied. Politicians accepted. The weary nation did not resist. The monarchy had returned, not through bloodshed, but through resignation. Let us leave the Republic here, buried in its own idealism, and turn our gaze to the approaching figure of Alfonso XII. A young king, born in exile, returning to a homeland still fractured, still searching for a balance between crown and constitution, tradition and change. The next chapter would be quieter, more stable, but beneath its surface, old tensions would continue to smoulder. Alfonso XII returned to Spain not as a conqueror, nor as a king imposed by force, but as a symbol, a carefully crafted image of youth, moderation, and renewal. He was only 17 when proclaimed king in 1874, yet the nation, weary of revolutions and experiments, embraced him with a cautious optimism. His mother, Isabella II, remained in exile, having abdicated her rights years earlier. The new king would be his own man, not merely the son of a fallen queen, but a monarch of reconciliation. His arrival marked the beginning of what would be known as the Bourbon Restoration, not simply the re-establishment of a dynasty, but the creation of a political system designed to tame Spain's chronic instability. The architect of this system was Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, a brilliant statesman and conservative intellectual. Cánovas envisioned a monarchy constrained not by rebellion, but by routine, a model where conflict was absorbed into a framework, where revolution gave way to rotation. At the heart of the restoration lay the turno pacifico, the peaceful turn. Power would alternate by agreement and manipulation between two main parties, the conservatives led by Cánovas and the liberals, who would be guided later by Praxedes Mateo Sagasta. Elections were held, but they were orchestrated. Results were negotiated before the votes were cast. In this way, Spain appeared democratic while remaining under firm control. For a time, it worked. The early years of Alfonso XII's reign brought a stability Spain had not known in decades. The Carlist War, now in its third and final phase, was suppressed with determination. Don Carlos's forces, though fierce, were finally cornered in the north. By 1876, the war ended. The Carlists were defeated, though their ideas and claim would survive in exile for generations. That same year, a new constitution was enacted, cautious and moderate. It reaffirmed the monarchy, the role of the Catholic Church, and the bicameral legislature. Civil liberties were promised, but often loosely defined. The crown held executive power, but shared it with ministers. It was, in many ways, a mirror of Alfonso himself, modest, balanced, and above all, designed to endure. Alfonso quickly won the admiration of the public. He was courteous, fluent in languages, and keenly aware of Spain's delicate state. He toured the provinces, listening more than speaking. He attended funerals of soldiers and visited hospitals during cholera outbreaks. His presence brought a sense of dignity that Spain had sorely missed. In 1878, he married Maria de las Mercedes of Orleans, a union celebrated by the people as a romantic fairy tale. But tragedy struck swiftly. Only 5 months into their marriage, the young queen fell ill and died, likely of typhoid or tuberculosis. The nation mourned with him. Songs were written in her memory. Her image, tender and luminous, lingered in the hearts of a people who had grown used to loss. Alfonso later remarried, this time to Maria Cristina of Austria, a more political union, but one that brought stability to the royal household. Together they began planning for the future of a monarchy that still walked a narrow ridge between past and present. Yet beneath the calm exterior of the Restoration, tensions simmered. The political system, while stable, was exclusionary. It left no space for republicans, socialists, anarchists, or regionalists. Elections were controlled by local caciques, powerful bosses who manipulated votes with bribes, pressure, or outright fraud. The illusion of democracy hid a deeper stagnation. In the countryside, poverty persisted. Land reform had failed. Millions of peasants remained landless, vulnerable to famine and disease. In the cities, industrial workers began to organize. New ideas arrived from Europe: socialism, anarchism, syndicalism, and found eager audiences among the dispossessed. Strikes, protests, and bombings would soon follow. In Catalonia and the Basque Country, cultural revival sparked demands for regional autonomy. The centralized model imposed by Madrid sat uneasily with communities that saw themselves as nations within a nation. Language, law, and identity became rallying points for a new kind of politics, neither royalist nor republican, but national. Alfonso was aware of these undercurrents, and he tried in small ways to address them. But his powers were limited and his time was short. In the autumn of 1885, while visiting the palace of El Pardo, Alfonso fell ill with fever. At first it seemed minor, but his condition worsened rapidly. Doctors whispered of tuberculosis, others of malaria. He lingered for weeks, coughing blood, his body weakening. On November 25th, at just 27 years old, Alfonso XII died. He left behind a pregnant wife and 2 daughters. Months later, Maria Cristina gave birth to a son, Alfonso III, born king, never having met his father. Let us pause here with the image of Alfonso VII, young, upright and dignified, carried through the streets of Madrid beneath mourning veils. He had ruled with grace, if not with grandeur. He had given Spain a moment of peace, however fragile. But his death would leave a void. And the restoration, already strained, would now be tested by a new kind of world, modern, restless, and increasingly impatient with the illusion of order. When Alfonso III entered the world in May of 1886, he was born not into a cradle, but onto a throne. His father, Alfonso XII, had been dead for 6 months. The infant king was crowned from the moment he drew breath, a monarch without memory, a symbol of continuity in a country that once again stood at a crossroads. His mother, Maria Cristina of Austria, assumed the regency. Graceful, composed, and deeply Catholic, she would govern Spain for nearly 2 decades, until her son reached maturity. Under her guidance, Spain did not seek reinvention, but preservation. The system built by Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, the Restauración, continued almost unchanged. The Turno Pacifico still defined political life, with the conservative and liberal parties alternating power through carefully managed elections. The monarchy remained symbolic and serene. Public order was paramount. Spain, on the surface, was stable. But beneath that surface, the country trembled with growing contradictions. The Industrial Revolution, long delayed, had finally taken root in select regions. In Catalonia, textile factories multiplied, and with them, a new industrial working class, exploited, concentrated, and radicalized. In the Basque Country, steel and shipbuilding fueled prosperity, but also gave rise to Basque nationalism. In Andalusia, rural laborers toiled under scorching suns, still landless, still voiceless. Strikes and protests became more frequent. The press, newly emboldened, chronicled each confrontation, each grievance. It was during these years that the anarchist movement grew strong. Spain, with its vast rural hinterlands and weak central enforcement, became fertile ground for the ideas of Bakunin and Kropotkin. Anarchist cells formed in cities and villages, preaching direct action and the abolition of the state. Some turned to violence. Between the 1890s and early 1900s, Spain suffered a wave of assassinations and bombings. Military officials, judges, and even Cánovas del Castillo himself were targeted. The government responded with brutal crackdowns. Prisons filled. Torture was reported. The spiral of violence deepened. Meanwhile, the colonial empire, once the pride of Spain, slipped through its fingers. In 1895, a fresh revolt erupted in Cuba, led by José Martí and the Cuban Revolutionary Party. The island had long chafed under Spanish control, and now, after decades of unrest, war returned. Spain responded with force, sending General Valeriano Weyler to suppress the rebellion. His tactics, including reconcentration camps that displaced thousands of civilians, sparked international outrage. The crisis intensified in 1898, when the United States, following the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, declared war on Spain. The conflict, brief, furious, and devastating, became known as the Spanish-American War. In a matter of months, Spain lost nearly all that remained of its overseas empire. Cuba gained independence under American oversight. Puerto Rico and the Philippines were ceded to the United States. Guam was lost. The defeat sent a shiver through the Spanish soul. The empire that had once stretched across the globe was now reduced to scattered fragments. The nation entered a period of deep reflection, known as the Generación del 98, the Generation of 98, as writers, poets and philosophers grappled with questions of identity, purpose and decay. Who was Spain, now that it was no longer an empire? Maria Cristina remained a steady figure through the storm. Her regency, marked by restraint and duty, gave the monarchy time to reconfigure itself. She understood the limits of her role. She consulted widely. She deferred to her ministers. But the currents beneath her feet were shifting faster than even the most diligent regent could control. In 1902, Alfonso XIII came of age. He was 16, tall, athletic, charming and intelligent. He had been raised as a king, trained to embody the Bourbon tradition, but also to modernize it. He spoke multiple languages, rode with elegance, and seemed eager to rule. The country watched him closely, wondering whether he would be a figure of reform or of repetition. His first years on the throne were full of optimism. He travelled extensively, visited military academies, inaugurated infrastructure projects. He showed concern for the poor and interest in modernization. Yet he also carried with him the traits that would come to define his reign: restlessness, impulsiveness, and a growing impatience with constitutional limits. In 1906, Alfonso XIII married Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Britain. The wedding, a grand celebration, was marred by tragedy. An anarchist bomb exploded along the route of the royal carriage, killing dozens. The couple survived, but the message was clear. The crown, once sheltered in reverence, now moved through streets laced with danger. As the 20th century advanced, Spain found itself increasingly ungovernable. The turno pacifico, the carefully arranged alternation of power, no longer reflected the popular will. Republicans, socialists, anarchists, Catalanists, Basque nationalists, and growing military factions all existed outside the rigid framework. The people, restless and aware, began to demand more than illusion. Alfonso XIII tried to balance tradition and innovation. He supported infrastructure, military reform and modernization. But he also meddled in politics, pushed governments aside and leaned toward authoritarian solutions. He seemed caught between worlds, born of a dying monarchy, ruling in a time that demanded more than birthright. Let us leave him here for now, young, confident, and not yet aware of the storms that would come. Spain had changed. The world had changed. The next decades would be marked not by ceremonial rule, but by upheaval, dictatorship, and civil war. In the next chapter, the mask of stability will fall. The monarchy will face its greatest test yet, not from foreign invaders, but from within. The reign of Alfonso XIII drifted slowly into troubled waters. What had begun with youthful promise and patriotic ceremonies would, over the next 3 decades, unravel into division, dictatorship, and ultimately, disaster. Spain, fractured by class, region, ideology, and memory, was no longer content to be ruled from above. The forces that once lay beneath the surface now surged forward, refusing to be ignored. As the 20th century advanced, the cracks in the Restauración system widened. The turno pacifico, once the illusion of choice, of political balance, had lost all credibility. The elections were openly manipulated. The alternating parties had grown indistinguishable, their ideologies hollowed by years of orchestrated compromise. The monarchy, instead of being a neutral referee, had become a silent accomplice in the Great Charade. And Alfonso III, rather than restraining himself within constitutional bounds, increasingly intervened. The king fancied himself a modern monarch, one who listened, advised, and, when necessary, acted. But Spain was not prepared to accept a Bourbon revival of personal rule, however subtle. And Alfonso's choices, impatient, impulsive, and sometimes short-sighted, only deepened the rift between crown and country. The social tensions of the new century were sharp and visceral. Spain's industrial zones, especially in Catalonia and the Basque Country, had grown restless. Strikes multiplied. The working class, increasingly politicized, rallied behind anarchist, socialist, and syndicalist movements. The Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, CNT, an anarcho-syndicalist trade union, grew rapidly in influence. In the fields of Andalusia, day labourers barely survived, still tied to a land they did not own. The church, long the spiritual anchor of the monarchy, found itself caught between conservatism and irrelevance. Education reform, secularism, and anti-clerical violence threatened its traditional place. The army, too, was restless, bloated, underfunded, and humiliated by colonial failures. It sought purpose and honor, often through politics. Then came Morocco. Spain's presence in North Africa, limited but deeply symbolic, became the stage for both military tragedy and political catastrophe. In 1921, at the Battle of Annual, Spanish forces suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Riffian rebels led by Abd el-Krim. Over 10,000 soldiers were killed in a matter of days. It was one of the worst military disasters in Spanish history. The country was stunned. Families wept. Parliament launched investigations, and behind it all loomed a shadow, Alfonso III. The king had taken a keen personal interest in the Moroccan campaign. He sent letters to commanders, offered unsolicited advice, and supported the military adventure enthusiastically. When the truth of the annual disaster emerged, so too did the king's involvement. The Expediente Picasso, a military report on the debacle, hinted at royal responsibility, but political pressure prevented it from being made fully public. Faith in the monarchy, already fragile, was now deeply wounded. In this climate of tension and uncertainty, a figure stepped forward. General Miguel Primo de Rivera. In September 1923, with the tacit support of Alfonso XXX, Primo de Rivera staged a bloodless coup in Barcelona. He declared the parliamentary system corrupt and paralyzed, and promised to restore order, honor, and national dignity. The king, rather than resisting, embraced the coup. Parliament was dissolved, the constitution suspended. The monarchy, now fully entwined with military dictatorship, slid quietly into authoritarianism. At first, many welcomed the change. Primo de Rivera projected simplicity and resolve. He dressed plainly, spoke directly, and claimed to be above partisanship. His regime suppressed strikes, built infrastructure, and tried to modernize the economy. He invested in roads, irrigation, and public works. He even created a single-party structure, the Unión Patriótica, to promote national unity, though it never captured popular enthusiasm. But time eroded his promise. Primo de Rivera lacked the ideological depth of true authoritarian leaders. His economic policies faltered, public debt mounted. His suppression of dissent alienated both left and right. Intellectuals fled or went silent. Catalan nationalism, once cautiously hopeful, was repressed with growing harshness. The military, initially supportive, began to turn on him. In 1930, weakened and isolated, Primo de Rivera resigned. He died shortly after, disgraced and forgotten. Alfonso III, having allowed the dictatorship to govern in his name, now stood exposed. He tried to return Spain to constitutional life. Elections were called, civil governance restored. But the spell had been broken. The people had tasted rule without consent and now demanded a say in the future. In municipal elections of April 1931, Republicans and Socialists triumphed in major cities. Though the elections were not national, the results were clear. The monarchy no longer held the confidence of the people. Crowds gathered in Madrid waving tricolour flags of the Republic. Republican leaders, cautious but resolute, demanded the king's departure. Alfonso did not abdicate, but he left. On April 14, 1931, he boarded a train and crossed into exile, first to France, then later to Italy. He insisted that he'd not renounce the crown, but that he left to avoid civil war. His departure was quiet, even dignified, but final. The Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. Let us pause here in that solemn, electric moment. The people in the plazas, the flags unfurled, the cheers and the uncertainty. A chapter had closed. Not only had a king gone into exile, but a century of monarchy, of manipulation, of restoration had come to an end. What followed would be turbulent, tragic, and transformative. In the next chapter, we will descend into the fires of the Republic, the clash of ideologies, and the war that would consume the soul of Spain. The bells that rang across Madrid on the morning of April 14, 1931, were not calling the faithful to prayer. They were ringing in a new era. From balconies and rooftops, from cafes and courthouses, the tricolour flag of the Second Spanish Republic, red, yellow and deep purple, unfurled into the spring air. It was a moment of sudden awakening, not born from violence but from decision, from ballots and public will. After centuries of monarchy, Spain had chosen a republic. The departure of Alfonso XIII had been quiet, nearly unnoticed. No riots, no last standoff in a palace courtyard, just a man with a suitcase boarding a train into exile. And in that calm, a vacuum opened, not of power, but of direction. For the Second Republic was not a continuation of anything. It was something altogether new, raw and unformed, an experiment without a clear blueprint. The Republic's provisional government was a patchwork of liberals, socialists and moderate Republicans, intellectuals and idealists bound together by a shared desire to break with the past, though not necessarily by a shared vision of the future. Their leader, Niceto Alcalá Zamora, a former monarchist turned Republican, took the presidency. His government promised rights, reason and reform, and it moved swiftly. Within its first year, the Republic declared freedom of speech, secular education, civil marriage, divorce rights and women's suffrage. Land reform was announced to redistribute vast rural estates to impoverished farmers. The church, long intertwined with state power, was untangled. Clerical subsidies were cut, religious orders were restricted, and secularism made the official character of public life. For some, these changes were overdue, a long-delayed embrace of European modernity. For others, they felt like an assault. The Spanish Catholic Church, humiliated and furious, became an entrenched adversary. Conservative landowners, military officers, and monarchist loyalists watched the unfolding reforms with growing alarm. The old order had not disappeared, it had merely receded, waiting for its moment. And so the Republic, even at its birth, was already embattled. The polarization of Spanish society, rural versus urban, church versus state, left versus right, sharpened quickly. Political parties splintered and reformed, newspapers became weapons, and debates in the Cortes often sounded more like battlefield cries than parliamentary speeches. In 1933, women voted for the first time in national elections. The conservative CIDA party, Confederación Española de Derechas Autónomas, led by José María Gil Robles, won the majority. Many on the left saw this as a betrayal. A republic, they believed, could not coexist with reactionary forces. Strikes broke out. Protests turned violent. In 1934, a socialist-led uprising in Asturias was brutally crushed by government forces using colonial troops from Morocco. The wounds left by this repression would not heal. They would fester. The Republic's early years had promised peace, but they had opened doors to struggle. The reforms had been bold but uneven. The expectations they awakened could not all be met. And the enemies they made, in the army, in the church, among the old aristocracy, would not forget. By 1936, Spain was on the edge. That year's elections returned the Popular Front, a coalition of leftist parties, to power. Manuel Azaña, a reformist intellectual, became president. But the right saw his election as a prelude to revolution. Rumours spread, generals whispered, monarchists and fascist sympathizers plotted in cafes and army barracks. On July 17, 1936, the long-awaited fracture came. Military units rose in Spanish Morocco. The uprising spread to the mainland. In some cities, the rebels seized control quickly. In others, they were repelled by civilian militias and loyalist soldiers. What began as a coup became something deeper, something darker. Spain was no longer simply divided. It was at war with itself. Let us stop here, on the threshold of that war, with the Republic gasping for air, with cities arming workers and peasants, with generals drafting battle plans in secret, with foreign powers watching closely. The dream of a democratic Spain was not yet dead, but it was bleeding. And the shadows of the coming conflict, of Madrid under siege, of Guernica burning, of brothers killing brothers, had begun to gather. In the next chapter we will enter the maelstrom, the Spanish Civil War, where monarchy, republic, fascism, communism, and memory itself would be torn apart. The Spanish Civil War began not with a single shot, but with silence. The silence of a country holding its breath as the rising dust of July 1936 signaled the collapse of its fragile political equilibrium. What had started as a military coup against the Second Republic rapidly unraveled into something far more profound. A war of identities, of histories, of ideas. Spain ceased to be one nation. It became two, each convinced it carried the soul of the country. On one side stood the Republicans, a chaotic coalition of left-wing parties, trade unions, secular reformers, socialists, anarchists, and communists. Their allegiance was to the Republic, to the elected government, to the promise, however fragile, of democracy and social transformation. But unity among them was fragile, fractured by internal rivalries and differing visions of revolution. Some wanted moderate reform, others wanted to dismantle the very fabric of the old Spain. On the other side were the nationalists, the rebel military, monarchists, Carlists, conservative Catholics, fascist phalangists, and many of the country's landowners and elites. They called themselves saviors of Spain, protectors of tradition, order, religion, and the nation's supposed purity. Their cause was led, eventually and decisively, by a reserved and methodical general from Galicia, Francisco Franco. Franco, at first merely one of many generals in the uprising, quickly maneuvered his way to supreme command. His rise was less theatrical than tactical, a slow consolidation of power built not on charisma but on calculation. He promised to restore Spain, to eliminate Reds and atheists, and to preserve Catholicism and national unity at all costs. The war tore through Spain like a fever. The front lines shifted like breath. Cities became symbols. Madrid, the heart of the Republic, endured siege after siege, its people starving yet unbroken. Barcelona, vibrant and radical, became a laboratory of anarchist revolution, with factories collectivized and hierarchies overturned. Seville, Granada, Burgos, each city told a different story, and each bore a different scar. Violence was everywhere. In nationalist territory, repression was swift and systematic. Suspected leftists were rounded up, priests gave blessings before executions, and mass graves filled under quiet olive groves. In Republican zones, church properties were seized, and in many places, clergy were executed. Anarchist and communist factions sometimes fought each other with as much venom as they did the nationalists. The war was not just between left and right. It was war between futures, between versions of what Spain could or should be. Foreign powers turned the Spanish Civil War into a rehearsal for larger horrors yet to come. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy threw their weight behind Franco. German planes bombed Spanish towns. Italian troops reinforced nationalist lines. The bombing of Guernica in 1937, immortalized by Picasso's painting, became the most infamous symbol of civilian terror, a warning that total war had come to the modern world. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union supported the Republic, sending arms and advisors, while also pushing for greater communist control. International brigades, idealists from France, Britain, the United States, and beyond, came to fight for the Republic, believing they were defending democracy against the rising tide of fascism. They brought with them poetry, hope, and rifles, but they could not stop the momentum. Franco's forces, better armed, better organized, and backed by the Catholic Church and conservative institutions, pushed forward. By 1938, the Republic was fracturing. Food was scarce. Morale was collapsing. Stalin's agents hunted Trotskyists and anarchists within the left, purging dissent in the name of unity. Internal betrayals sapped strength. Franco advanced with slow inevitability. In the early months of 1939, Madrid finally fell. Republican leaders fled or were captured. Thousands were executed in the weeks that followed. The war was over. But the pain, the memory, was not. Nearly 500,000 Spaniards had died. Countless more were imprisoned, exiled, or broken. The country lay in ruins, its cities scarred, its fields barren, its people silent with trauma. Francisco Franco stood alone at the helm of a devastated Spain. He was no longer a general. He was now Caudillo, a ruler in the style of Rome, cloaked in military uniform and religious symbolism, claiming to be both the sword and the cross. Let us rest here at the end of civil war, with the taste of ashes still on the wind. Spain had destroyed itself in search of itself. And from the silence that followed, a dictatorship would rise, long, cold, and unyielding. In the next chapter, we will descend into the decades of Franco's rule, a kingdom without a king, a throne kept empty under iron rule, and a Spain suspended between memory and fear. The guns fell silent in 1939, but Spain did not breathe. It held itself stiff, suspended in an unnatural stillness, as Francisco Franco declared victory in the birth of a new Spain, not of the Republic, nor of the monarchy, but of the Estado Nacional, the national state. What emerged was not a rebirth, but a burial. Democracy, liberalism, regional identity, and pluralism were laid to rest beneath layers of censorship, uniforms, and prayers. Franco's regime was not built in days or declared in manifestos. It was sculpted slowly, with cold precision. At its core stood the Generalissimo himself, a man neither flamboyant nor philosophically profound, but steady, calculating, and deeply certain of his mission. He believed he had saved Spain from communism, anarchy, and decay, and he would preserve it with discipline, faith, and silence. He did not restore the monarchy, not yet. Though he declared Spain a kingdom in 1947, there was no king. The throne remained empty, a symbolic placeholder, like a velvet cushion set upon a stone. Franco ruled not as regent, but as sovereign in all but name. The monarchy would return, he promised, but only when the time was right. Until then, he would be both ruler and guardian. The Spain he governed was a land locked in time. Political parties were banned. Only one official organization, the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de los Jones, existed, and even it was stripped of real power, existing more as a symbol than a driver of policy. The regime's guiding ideology was a mixture of Catholic traditionalism, authoritarian corporatism, and fervent nationalism. It had no place for dissent and no patience for doubt. Schools taught obedience, religion, and patriotism. The press printed only what the regime allowed. Public speech was monitored. Private conversations were cautious. The blue-shirted Falangistas, the Guardia Civil, and neighborhood informants ensured that the walls always listened. The Catholic Church regained its privileged place. In exchange for moral support, Franco granted the Church control over education, marriage, and much of the cultural life of the nation. Priests blessed his speeches. Churches flew the national flag. And Franco, in return, presented himself as the protector of Christendom, a warrior of the Crusade reborn. Economically, Spain in the 1940s was a nation of scarcity and hunger. The post-war years, elsewhere in Europe a time of rebuilding, were for Spain an era of isolation. The international community, having witnessed Franco's support from Hitler and Mussolini, turned away. Spain was excluded from the Marshall Plan. Diplomats kept their distance. Borders remained tight. Rationing persisted into the early 1950s. Black markets flourished. Malnutrition became widespread. Villages stagnated. Cities crumbled. The regime's policy of autarkia, economic self-sufficiency, proved disastrous. Franco clung to it with stubborn faith, insisting that Spain must not depend on a world he did not trust. But history, relentless as ever, knocked on his door. By the mid-1950s, the geopolitical map had shifted. The Cold War hardened. The United States, once critical of Franco, now saw him as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Ideological purity gave way to strategic convenience. In 1953, Spain signed the Pact of Madrid with the US, trading military bases for economic aid and diplomatic recognition. American dollars flowed in. With them came tractors, radios, and cautious optimism. Franco adjusted, but never relented. In the 1960s, Spain entered what would be called the Spanish Miracle, an era of rapid economic growth. Highways appeared, tourism exploded, foreign investment surged, a middle class began to emerge, cities expanded. Spanish workers seeking opportunity migrated to Germany, France, and Switzerland. They sent money home, remittances that lifted villages from poverty. But prosperity did not bring freedom. Even as the economy modernized, the regime remained frozen. The political structure did not change. The Cortes Españolas, Franco's hand-picked legislature, debated nothing of real consequence. Workers had no right to strike. Basque and Catalan languages were banned in public life. University students were arrested for reading the wrong books. Intellectuals whispered in code. Exiles watched from Paris and Mexico City. Yet Franco, aging but undiminished, remained resolute. He spoke little. He appeared often, in uniform, in silence, beneath a cross or beside a flag. His image was printed in every school, hung in every town hall. He was not loved by all, but feared by many, and for some quietly admired. He had given Spain order, they said. He had saved it from chaos. Still, the question of succession lingered. The monarchy, promised, postponed, hovered in the background. In 1969, Franco made his decision. He bypassed Juan de Bourbon, son of Alfonso III, and chose instead his grandson, Juan Carlos. The young prince, born in exile and raised under Franco's watchful eye, was declared successor with the title Príncipe de España. He would be king someday, but only after Franco, and only if he followed the path laid out for him. Juan Carlos accepted, quietly and cautiously. He played the part. He shook hands, he smiled, he waited. Franco, meanwhile, grew frail. His speeches slowed, his movements stiffened, but his grip did not loosen. he ruled until the end. Let us stop here in the twilight of a Spain frozen by its own past. A kingdom without a crowned king, led by a man who saw himself as eternal. Beneath the stillness, a new generation stirred. The world was changing, and Spain could not remain untouched forever. In the final chapter, we will witness Franco's last breath, the return of the crown, and the slow rebirth of a monarchy within a democracy, a restoration unlike any that had come before. Francisco Franco's final years unfolded like the slow winding of an old clock. Spain, by then, had grown used to his stillness, his ritual appearances, the droning tone of his speeches on national holidays. His portrait hung in government offices, classrooms, train stations. But behind the carefully preserved image, the man was weakening. The nation, too, was waiting. Not with revolution, not with guns, but with breath held quietly, watching for a moment it knew must come. The 1970s brought change to the edges of Spain's tightly wound order. The economy, long hailed for its growth, began to sputter under the weight of inflation and unemployment. Student protests, once unthinkable, gained traction. Workers went on strike despite government bans. International pressure increased. The world had moved into the television age, the space age, the age of social movements. And Spain, with its rigid censors and antique slogans, looked increasingly out of place. Franco had already chosen his heir. Juan Carlos, grandson of Alfonso III, had walked carefully through the general's shadow for years. Groomed to be obedient, he had publicly pledged loyalty to the Movimiento Nacional, the sole legal political structure. Yet those who watched closely sensed a quiet distance behind the prince's polite eyes, an awareness that the Spain he would one day inherit could not remain as it was. In 1973, Franco stepped back slightly, naming Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco as Prime Minister, a loyal servant of the regime, a hardliner with no intention of reform. But fate intervened. That December, Carrero Blanco was assassinated in Madrid by ETA, the Basque separatist organization. His armored car was blown into the air by a massive underground bomb. The regime was shaken to its core. Franco, aged and reeling, returned more visibly to power, but his health continued to fail. Over the next 2 years, he appeared less often. His speeches became rare and laboured. Rumours spread. On October 30th, 1975, he fell into a coma. For days, the Spanish people waited. On November 20th, after multiple heart attacks and a prolonged agony, Francisco Franco died. He was 82 years old. His funeral was grand, orchestrated with the full weight of state and church. His body was laid to rest in the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, a vast sombre monument carved into the mountains, built in part by the forced labour of political prisoners. It was meant to be eternal. A shrine to national reconciliation, it became instead a tomb of contested memory. And then the silence lifted. 2 days later, Juan Carlos I was proclaimed king. He stood before the Cortes in full military dress, not to reaffirm dictatorship, but to open a new chapter. With calm, measured words, he committed to being the king of all Spaniards. He did not speak of vengeance. He did not promise revolution. He promised democracy. What followed was not immediate, nor without risk. The transition, la transición, as it came to be called, was fragile and imperfect, but it was real. Over the next several years, Juan Carlos, along with Prime Minister Adolfo Suárez and a generation of reformers, guided Spain from dictatorship to constitutional monarchy. Political parties were legalized, exiles returned, press freedom was restored. In 1978, a new constitution was approved by referendum, establishing Spain as a parliamentary democracy with the king as ceremonial head of state. It was not without violence. ETA continued its campaign of terror. Far-right groups resisted reform. In 1981, a group of civil guard officers stormed the Cortes in an attempted coup, holding parliament at gunpoint. The world watched, breathless. And then on television appeared King Juan Carlos, calm, authoritative in military uniform. He condemned the coup, declared his loyalty to democracy, and ordered the rebels to stand down. They did. From that moment, the monarchy was not merely restored. It was reborn. Juan Carlos became not just king, but guardian of a democratic Spain. The crown, once associated with privilege and autocracy, now stood as a symbol of unity, stability, and reconciliation. And Spain, long a land of divisions, between monarchist and republican, centralist and regionalist, tradition and change, found at last a middle path. It was not perfect. Old wounds remained. The legacy of Franco lingered in architecture, in names of streets, in whispered memories. The monarchy in time would face its own scandals and reckonings. But the silence was gone. The people spoke now, in ballots, in books, in plazas. Let us end here in a Spain where a crown sits not above the people but beside them, a Spain that endured empires, war, exile, dictatorship, and rebirth. From Ferdinand and Isabella to Alfonso XIII, from exile to restoration, from civil war to a democratic monarchy, the Spanish crown has been a mirror to Spain itself. Resilient, flawed, proud, and always reaching towards something better. And in the quiet of this long story's end, we hear not the roar of conquest, nor the clash of rebellion, but the steady heartbeat of a nation still writing itself day by day.